Hello everyone, welcome back to Midnight Lullaby. I know many of you are here to drift gently into sleep. Before you close your eyes, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Let me know where in the world you're listening from. Now, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let the story carry you into dreams. The cookbook was buried under layers of tissue paper in the bottom of the third cardboard box. Wrapped with the careful precision my mother had always applied to preserving things she considered precious. Even through my grief, I recognized her methodical approach to storage, each item cushioned and protected as though it might be needed again someday. 3 weeks had passed since the funeral, and I'd finally begun the overwhelming task of sorting through her belongings. The house felt hollow without her presence, each room echoing with memories that seemed to float just beyond my ability to grasp them fully. The kitchen, especially, felt wrong, too clean, too quiet, missing the constant symphony of cooking sounds that had defined it throughout my childhood. The cookbook itself was unremarkable at first glance. A simple composition book with a marbled black and white cover, the kind students use for taking notes. The binding was worn soft with age, and the corners showed the kind of gentle damage that comes from decades of careful use. On the cover, in my mother's careful cursive handwriting, were the words, "Family Recipes, Est. 1962. I'd seen her writing in this book countless times during my childhood, adding notes in the margins, adjusting ingredient quantities, or marking successful modifications with small stars and happy faces. It had been her constant kitchen companion, consulted for everything from weeknight dinners to holiday feasts. Opening it felt like stepping into a museum of my childhood. The first page contained her recipe for chocolate chip cookies, the same cookies that had appeared in my lunchbox every Friday throughout elementary school. Her handwriting was neat and precise, each instruction clearly numbered. Ingredient measurements written in both standard and metric units with typical thoroughness. I flipped through the familiar pages. Her famous beef stew, the holiday stuffing that had made our Thanksgivings legendary among our extended family, the birthday cake recipe she'd used for every celebration since I could remember. Each page held not just instructions for food preparation, but small autobiographical details, notes about which cousin had requested the recipe, adjustments made for my father's dietary restrictions, reminders about cooking times that worked best in our particular oven. It was near the back of the book. Past the dessert section and into the pages she'd reserved for experimental recipes and holiday specialties, that I found the recipe that didn't belong. The page was written in her handwriting, with the same careful attention to detail as all the others. But the title, written in slightly faded blue ink, made my hands tremble as I read it. Braised Disobedient Child, serves 68. Below the title, in her familiar script, was a complete recipe. Preparation time 3-4 hours. Cooking method slow braising with root vegetables. and listed among the ingredients, written as matter of factly as any other component, was one disobedient child, 8-12 years preferred. Though older children can be tenderized with proper preparation. I stared at the page, my vision blurring slightly as I tried to process what I was reading. It had to be some kind of joke. A dark humor I'd never known my mother possessed. Maybe something she'd copied from a horror movie or a Halloween cookbook. Though the dating at the top of the page suggested it had been written in 1974, when I was 10 years old. The instructions were detailed and methodical, written in the same style as all her other recipes. Begin by preparing the child, it read. Remove from familiar surroundings and wash thoroughly. Pat dry and season with fear and uncertainty. Allow to marinate in isolation for 2-3 hours, turning occasionally to ensure even distribution of despair. My rational mind rejected every word. But my mother's voice seemed to echo from the carefully formed letters. I could almost hear her reading the recipe aloud. The same way she'd narrated cooking processes throughout my childhood, explaining each step with patient authority. The ingredient list continued. 2 cups of mother's disappointment, 3 tablespoons of wasted potential, 1 large onion zevel for the tears, assorted root vegetables, some to represent the child's severed connections to family, and 1 bottle of aged resentment, open to breathe for at least an hour before use. At the bottom of the page, in smaller handwriting, was a note. This recipe has been in our family for generations. Great-grandmother used it during the difficult winter of 1932. Grandmother perfected the seasoning during the war years. The key is patience. Rushing the process results in tough, inedible results. Always remember, disobedience is a flavor that must be completely cooked out. I closed the cookbook quickly and set it aside, my hands shaking. The logical explanation was that this was some kind of elaborate joke. Perhaps something she'd written for a Halloween party or as part of a creative writing exercise. My mother had possessed a dry wit and an appreciation for dark humor that I'd inherited, though she'd rarely expressed it so explicitly. But the dating, the handwriting, the seamless integration with her, other recipes, everything suggested, had been written during my high childhood, or during years when I'd been struggling with typical childhood rebellions and testing the boundaries she'd established. I forced myself to return to sorting through her belongings, focusing on practical decisions about what to keep and what to donate. The cookbook remained on the kitchen table, its presence somehow heavier than its physical weight should have allowed. That evening, I called my sister Rachel, who lived across the country, but had been equally close to our mother. I found Mom's recipe book. I said, keeping my voice casual. It's amazing how detailed her notes were. Do you remember her having a strange sense of humor about cooking? Rachel laughed. Oh yes. She was always making jokes about us being ingredients in her recipes. Remember how she used to threaten to put us in the stew when we misbehaved? She'd chase us around the kitchen with that big wooden spoon. saying she was going to season us properly. My blood went cold. I did remember those moments not as jokes, but as playful childhood interactions. Our mother chasing us around the kitchen, laughing as she threatened to add us to whatever she was cooking. At the time, it had seemed like normal maternal teasing. "Do you remember anything specific?" I asked. "Any particular recipes she joked about?" "Well, there was that one she always threatened us with when we were really acting up. Something about braised children. She'd describe the whole process, marinating us in timeout, seasoning us with consequences. We thought it was hilarious. After we hung up, I returned to the cookbook with trembling hands. The recipe was still there, as detailed and methodical as I'd remembered. But now, reading it again, I began to notice details that suggested it wasn't entirely fictional. The margins contained small notes in different ink colors, as though the recipe had been modified over time. Reduce marinating time for sensitive children. Read one notation. Extra seasoning needed for particularly stubborn cases. Read another. And at the very bottom, in pencil rather than ink, successfully tested 30, 50 out of 74. Results satisfactory. Child much more compliant afterward. March 15, 1974. I would have been 10 years old, and I distinctly remembered that spring as a turning point in my childhood. I'd been going through a particularly rebellious phase, talking back, refusing to do chores, generally testing every boundary my parents had established. And then, quite suddenly, I'd become a model child, obedient, helpful, eager to please. I'd always attributed the change to maturity, to finally understanding the importance of following rules and respecting authority. But now, trying to remember the specific events that had triggered my transformation, I found my memories strangely unclear. I remembered being defiant about something chores, maybe, or homework. I remembered my mother's disappointment, her patient explanations about consequences and responsibility. But there was a gap in my memory. Several days that felt fuzzy and indistinct, like trying to remember a dream weeks after waking. What I did remember clearly was the feeling of emerging from that period fundamentally changed. More compliant, more aware of my mother's expectations, more eager to avoid disappointing her. At the time, it had felt like growing up. Now, it felt like something else entirely. I flipped through the rest of the cookbook more carefully, looking for other recipes that seemed out of place. Most were exactly what I expected, family favorites, holiday specialties, experiments with new flavors and techniques. But scattered throughout were others that made my skin crawl. Stewed teenage attitude included ingredients like 3 cups of parental authority and 1 large portion of natural consequences. The instructions involved slow cooking till all rebellion has evaporated, and seasoning with reality or till tempered and compliant. Roasted academic failure. Called 1. Failing report card. Call for workout for go. Thoroughly cleaned of excuses. And 2 cups of disappointed expectations, simmered until bitter. The cooking method involved high heat applied consistently until child reaches proper academic temperature. Each recipe was dated, and cross-referencing with my memories, they corresponded to periods when either Rachel or I had experienced significant behavioral changes. Times when we'd been struggling with some aspect of growing up, only to emerge from brief, strangely unclear periods as improved versions of ourselves. The most disturbing discovery came near the very back of the book, on a page that looked newer than the others. The recipe was titled, "Cured Adult Child. Serves one," and was dated just 6 months ago, around the time I'd been going through my divorce, when I'd been staying with my mother for several weeks while I sorted out my life. One grown child, preferably one who has lost their way. The ingredients began: 3 cups of maternal wisdom, aged until sharp, 2 tablespoons of gentle guidance mixed with firm boundaries, 1 large helping of unconditional love, prepared with infinite patience. The instructions were different from the others, gentler, more nurturing, but still following the same methodical structure. Allow the lost child to marinate in safety and acceptance. Apply steady heat of maternal concern until defensive barriers begin to soften. Season with memories of childhood stability until natural flavors begin to emerge. At the bottom was a note. This is the most important recipe in the collection. All the earlier preparations were practice for this moment, helping a grown child remember who they truly are beneath the layers of adult disappointment and failure. I remembered those weeks with my mother vividly. I'd arrived broken and angry, my marriage in ruins, my career stagnant, my sense of self completely undermined by months of conflict and legal battles. I'd expected judgment, lectures about the choices I'd made and the ways I'd failed to live up to her expectations. Instead, she'd simply taken care of me, cooked my favorite meals, listened without offering unwanted advice, created a space where I could heal and remember who I was before everything had gone wrong. By the time I'd moved into my own apartment, I'd felt transformed, not just recovered, but somehow better than I'd been before the crisis. Now, reading her recipe for my own rehabilitation, I understood that her nurturing hadn't been instinctive or spontaneous. It had been deliberate, methodical, guided by the same careful attention to process and outcome that she'd applied to every aspect of cooking and child rearing. The thought should have disturbed me, but instead, I felt a strange kind of awe. My mother had been not just a loving parent, but a masterful one, someone who had understood that raising children was both art and science, requiring patience, precision, and a deep understanding of how different ingredients combined to create desired results. I spent the next several hours reading through every recipe in the book, both the conventional ones and the unsettling ones that dealt with children as ingredients. Gradually, a pattern emerged that was both disturbing and oddly beautiful. My mother hadn't seen cooking and parenting as separate activities. To her, they were aspects of the same fundamental process, taking raw materials and transforming them through careful attention and proper technique, into something nourishing and good. The recipes for cooking children weren't metaphors or jokes. They were literal instructions for the process of raising us, breaking down our problematic behaviors, seasoning us with appropriate consequences, and slow cooking us into the people she believed we could become. The dates and notes corresponded perfectly to the major turning points in both Rachel's and my development. Every time one of us had gone through a difficult period and emerged improved, there was a corresponding recipe documenting the process she'd used to guide our transformation. What disturbed me wasn't the revelation that she'd been deliberately shaping us. All good parents do that. It was the realization of how skillfully and systematically she'd done it, and how completely unaware we'd been of the process. Reading the recipes was like discovering the blueprint for my own personality. Every value I held, every behavioral pattern I developed, every way I approached problems and relationships, all of it could be traced back to specific ingredients and cooking methods she'd applied during my childhood. I wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or horrified. Had I ever been authentically myself, or was I simply the successful result of her careful recipe following? But then I found the final recipe, written on the very last page of the book in handwriting that was shakier than the rest, clearly written during her final illness. Recipe for letting go serves one mothered. The ingredients were simple, all one lifetime of love, carefully accumulated. 2 grown children, properly seasoned and ready for independence. 3 cups of faith in the preparation process. 1 large portion of acceptance that the cooking is done. The instructions were brief. Combine all ingredients gently. Heat with pride until warm, but not overwhelming. Serve with complete trust in the recipes already shared. Allow to cool naturally, knowing the flavors will continue to develop long after the cooking has ended. At the bottom, in pencil, was her final note. The best recipes aren't just about creating something good to eat. They're about nourishing the people we love, giving them what they need to become who they're meant to be. The cookbook ends here, but the cooking continues in every choice they make, every kindness they show, every time they remember that love is both an ingredient and a method. I closed the cookbook and sat in my mother's kitchen as the afternoon light faded through the windows. The silence that had felt wrong earlier now felt peaceful, expectant, as though the room were waiting to see what I would do with everything she'd taught me. I understood now that the recipes, all of them, both the conventional ones and the disturbing ones that had shaken me so deeply, were her gift to me. Not just instructions for cooking food, but a complete guide to the art of nurturing, of transforming raw potential into something beautiful and nourishing. The thought that my personality and values had been deliberately crafted no longer felt threatening. Instead, it felt like discovering that I was the result of a master chef's greatest recipe, that everything good about me had been carefully cultivated by someone who loved me enough to invest decades in perfecting the process. And the fact that she documented it all, preserved every technique and insight for me to find after she was gone, felt like the final ingredient in her most important recipe. The one that would help me understand not just who I was, but how to continue becoming who I was meant to be. I picked up the cookbook again and turned to a blank page near the back. Taking a pen from the kitchen drawer, I began to write. Recipe for honoring a mother's love. Serves future generations. Begin with gratitude for lessons learned, even those that seemed difficult at the time. Add understanding of the difference between control and guidance, between manipulation and love. Season with forgiveness for any methods that seem harsh from an adult perspective, remembering that all cooking requires some heat to transform raw ingredients into nourishment. I paused, thinking about my own future, about the possibility of children who might someday need their own careful preparation and seasoning, combined with commitment to continue the tradition, not by following the same recipes exactly, but by understanding the principles behind them. Love requires both tenderness and firmness. Growth requires both comfort and challenge. The best cooking happens when the chef cares more about nourishment than about control. As I wrote, I could almost feel my mother's presence in the kitchen with me, not as a ghost or memory, but as a living part of who I'd become. Every word I wrote was seasoned with her influence. Every decision I made would be guided by the values she'd so carefully instilled. The cookbook would stay with me, I decided, not hidden away as a disturbing curiosity, but treasured as what it truly was, a complete manual for the art of loving someone enough to help them become their best self. And someday, when I had children of my own, I would add my own recipes to the collection, documenting the methods I'd learned for nurturing growth and transformation. After all, the best family recipes are always the ones passed down from generation to generation, improved and refined, but never fundamentally changed. Love, it turns out, has always been the most important ingredient. Story 2. The cardboard box felt heavier than it should have as I carried it down to the curb. 23 years of accumulated memories reduced to items for the garbage truck. Moving out of my childhood home meant making difficult decisions, and Mr. Patches was one of them. I remember hesitating at the front door, holding the worn teddy bear one last time. His brown fur had faded to an uneven tan, and one glass eye hung loose by a single thread. The red bow tie I'd insisted on when I was 7 was now a dull rust color, frayed at the edges. My fingers traced the familiar texture of his matted fur, remembering countless nights when he'd been my guardian against the darkness. But I was 30 now, starting fresh in a new apartment across town. There was no room for childhood relics in my carefully curated adult life. The bear went into the box with photo albums, broken toys, and other remnants of who I used to be. The morning garbage truck rumbled past at exactly 6, 15, as it had every Tuesday for as long as I could remember. I watched from my bedroom window as the mechanical arms lifted the containers, crushing and compacting years of my past into anonymous waste. Mr. Patches was gone, and I felt the peculiar lightness that comes with letting go. That first night in my new apartment, I slept deeply. The unfamiliar sounds of the city, distant sirens, the hum of late, night traffic, voices echoing from the courtyard below, created a symphony that was both strange and oddly comforting. My new mattress was firmer than the old one, and the walls were painted a crisp white that reflected the streetlights in gentle, geometric patterns. I woke naturally as dawn light filtered through the unfamiliar blinds. The golden rays painted everything in warm amber tones, making my sparse furniture look almost welcoming. I stretched, feeling genuinely refreshed for the first time in months, and turned to face the pillow beside me. Mr. Patches was there. Not a bear like him, or a similar toy. It was unmistakably him. The same faded brown fur, the same loose eye hanging by its thread, the same rust-colored bow tie with its familiar frayed edges. Even the small stain on his left ear, from when I'd spilled grape juice during a tea party when I was 9. I sat up so quickly that my vision blurred. My hands shook as I reached toward him, stopping just inches from his worn fur. The rational part of my mind began cataloging explanations. I must have packed him by accident. In my exhaustion, I must have pulled him from a box without thinking. But I remembered placing him deliberately in that garbage box. Remembered watching the truck take him away. I picked him up, and his familiar weight settled into my palms like he'd never left. The texture of his fur was exactly as I remembered, soft in some places, matted and rough in others. The loose eye moved when I tilted his head, creating a winking effect that had once made me giggle, but now made my stomach tighten with unease. The apartment suddenly felt different around us. The morning light seemed dimmer, and the sounds from outside became muffled, as though someone had wrapped the building in cotton. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, steady but too loud, like a drum keeping time for something I couldn't identify. I spent the morning searching through every box, every bag, every corner of my new space. Nothing else from the garbage box was there. No photo albums, no broken toys, no other childhood remnants. Only Mr. Patches, returned like a loyal pet who'd found his way home across impossible distances. By afternoon, I'd almost convinced myself of the logical explanation. Moving stress, lack of sleep. The confusion of new surroundings. It was easy to make mistakes. I must have absent-mindedly saved him while packing other items. The mind plays tricks when overwhelmed. I placed him on a shelf in my bedroom, telling myself it was temporary, just until I could properly dispose of him again. But throughout the day, I found myself glancing toward the shelf, checking to make sure he was still there, or perhaps hoping he wouldn't be. That evening, I called my sister Rachel. Her voice was bright and familiar through the phone, grounding me in normalcy. "How's the new place?" she asked. Good. Different. I hesitated. Rachel, do you remember my old teddy bear, Mr. Patches? She laughed. Of course. You carried that thing everywhere until you were, 12? 13. Why? What happened to him? I mean, when did I stop playing with him? The line went quiet for a moment. Don't you remember? Mom threw him away when we moved to the Maple Street house. You cried for hours. She said you were too old for stuffed animals, that it was time to grow up. You must have been about 10. My throat went dry. But I had him through high school. I'm sure I did. No, honey, that was your phase with those music posters and books. You were so angry about the bear that you refused to have any toys in your room for years. Mom felt terrible about it later. After we hung up, I stared at the shelf where Mr. Patches sat. His remaining eye seemed to watch me, and I noticed how the loose one hung at just the right angle to create shadows on his face. In the dim light, those shadows looked almost like expressions, sometimes sad, sometimes knowing, sometimes something else entirely. I tried to work, to focus on unpacking the rest of my belongings, but my attention kept drifting back to him. The way the evening light caught the faded patches in his fur, the slight sag in his posture that made him look tired, or perhaps resigned. The absolute stillness of him, which somehow seemed more profound than mere lifelessness. The second night, I placed him in the living room before bed. If I was going to keep him temporarily, he didn't need to be in my bedroom, watching me sleep with that loose eye. I said good night to him, feeling foolish, and went to bed. I woke again at dawn, turning instinctively toward the empty pillow beside me. Mr. Patches wasn't there, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. See, I told myself, just stress and confusion. Everything was normal now. But when I padded to the kitchen to make coffee, there he was, sitting on the counter beside the coffee maker, not slumped against something, not fallen from a height, sitting upright, as though someone had carefully positioned him there, waiting for me to discover him. The morning light through the kitchen window illuminated him differently than it had in the bedroom. Here, the shadows fell across his face in new patterns, creating the illusion of different expressions. His remaining glass eye caught the light and held it, creating a tiny, intense point of reflection that seemed almost alive. I made my coffee in silence, hyper-aware of his presence. The familiar sounds of morning, the coffee maker's burble, the distant traffic, the neighbor's dog barking felt muted and far away. Even the taste of my coffee seemed different, less bitter, as though my senses had been somehow muffled. The third day, I tried leaving the apartment entirely, taking him with me in a bag to donate to a charity shop downtown. The volunteer at the donation center was a kind elderly woman who smiled when she saw him. "Oh, what a sweet old bear," she said, examining his worn fur and loose eye. "He's been well loved, hasn't he? These old ones have so much character." I nodded and left quickly, not wanting to explain or answer questions. Walking back to my car, I felt that same lightness from before, the relief of letting go. Mr. Patches would find a new child to comfort, and I could finally move forward into my adult life without the strange weight of his presence. But driving home, I found myself taking longer routes, stopping for unnecessary errands, delaying my return to the apartment. Something in my chest felt tight, like anxiety, but different. Like homesickness for a place I'd never been. That evening, the apartment felt too quiet. I tried watching television, reading, organizing my remaining belongings, but nothing could shake the sense that something was missing. Not just absent, actively gone, leaving behind an emptiness that seemed larger than what had been taken. I went to bed early, telling myself it was just the strangeness of a new place, the emotional exhaustion of moving. These feelings would pass. Everything would feel normal soon. I woke in darkness, not at dawn, but in the deep middle of the night. The streetlights created their familiar geometric patterns on the walls, but something was different. The shadows seemed deeper, and the sounds from outside were completely gone. Even the ever-present hum of city life had ceased. Leaving a silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. I turned toward the pillow beside me, already knowing what I would find. Mr. Patches was there, but not as he'd been before. His remaining eye was gone now, leaving behind a small, dark hollow in his face. The loose thread that had held the other eye hung straight down, like a tear that would never fall. His bow tie was missing entirely, leaving behind only a faded outline on his chest fur, where it had been tied for so many years. But somehow, eyeless and diminished, he seemed more present than ever. The hollows where his eyes had been created shadows that suggested depth, as though I could see through them into some vast, dark space beyond. His tilted head gave him an air of patient listening, as though he were waiting for me to say something, to acknowledge what we both knew. I reached toward him with trembling fingers, and when I touched his fur, it felt different. Not worn and familiar, but somehow deeper, as though my fingers were sinking into something that had more substance than it should. The texture was wrong, not quite fur, not quite fabric, but something in between that made my skin crawl. "You keep coming back," I whispered to the darkness. The words hung in the silent air, and in the quality of that silence, I heard something like agreement. Not a sound, but a sense of response, as though the darkness itself were nodding. I pulled my hand away, but the sensation of his altered fur lingered on my fingertips. The feeling was cold and somehow sticky, like I'd touched something that didn't want to let go. I rubbed my fingers against the sheets, but the sensation remained. As I lay there in the profound silence, fragments of memories began surfacing. Not the clear, bright memories of childhood play, but dim, uncertain recollections that felt more like dreams than remembrances. Nights when I'd awakened to find my room rearranged. Mornings when toys I'd put away were in different positions. The time I'd insisted that Mr. Patches had moved during the night, and my mother's worried look when she'd asked me to explain what I meant. Had he always been moving? Had he always been coming back? And if so, why couldn't I remember? The silence stretched on, and gradually, I became aware of other absences. The digital clock beside my bed was dark. The subtle vibration of the refrigerator had stopped. Even my own breathing seemed muted, as though the sound were being absorbed by something hungry for noise. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but behind my eyelids, I could still see those empty eye sockets, still feel the wrongness of his changed texture. The darkness behind my eyelids was complete and somehow active, as though it were looking back at me through the hollows where glass eyes used to be. When I finally slept, I dreamed of the charity shop. But in the dream, the kind elderly volunteer was examining Mr. Patches with confusion. "Strange," she was saying, turning him over in her hands. "I could have sworn this bear had eyes when you brought him in, and wasn't there a bow tie?" In the dream, I wanted to tell her that yes, there had been eyes and a bow tie, that something was wrong, that bears don't change themselves. But when I tried to speak, my voice made no sound, and the volunteer's face began to shift and change, becoming younger, then older, then young again, as though she were cycling through every person who had ever tried to separate us. I woke at dawn to find the apartment filled with normal sounds again. The refrigerator hummed. The clock displayed the time in bright red numbers, and outside, the city had returned to life. But Mr. Patches remained eyeless on the pillow beside me, more present than ever in his diminishment. Now, as I write this, he sits on my desk, facing me as I type. Each day, he loses a little more, threads from his bow tie outline, patches of fur, or the stuffing that gave him his familiar weight. But each loss seems to make him more essentially himself, as though he's shedding everything unnecessary to reveal some truer nature underneath. I've stopped trying to give him away. I understand now that it was never really possible. Some connections, once formed, reshape reality around themselves. Some returns are inevitable, written into the fabric of who we become. Sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I catch movement, the slight turn of a head, the settling of limbs into a new position. When I look directly, he's always still, always exactly where I left him. But the feeling of movement lingers, like the afterimage of something bright. I wonder, sometimes, about the child who will find him after I'm gone. Will they recognize him for what he is? Will they understand that some toys choose their children rather than the other way around? Or perhaps there won't be another child. Perhaps this is simply how it was always meant to be, the two of us, grown older together, him becoming less while somehow becoming more, me learning to accept the strange physics of love that refuses to acknowledge the rules of a rational world. And the evening light is fading now, and soon it will be time for sleep. I'll brush my teeth, turn off the lights, and settle into bed. And in the morning, when I wake and turn toward the pillow beside me, He'll be there, waiting patiently in whatever form he's chosen to wear that day. After all, some things, the most important things, never really let us go. They just change shape and keep coming back. Story 3. The highway stretches ahead of me like a black ribbon, unspooling endlessly beneath the pale glow of my headlights. It's past midnight, and the road belongs to me alone. Or so I thought when I first noticed them. 2 pinpricks of light in my rearview mirror, distant but persistent, following the same path through this empty landscape of rolling hills and scattered farmhouses. I shift in my seat, adjusting my grip on the steering wheel. The leather feels warm beneath my palms, warmed by hours of driving through the night. My destination is still 3 hours away, a small town whose name I can barely pronounce, where a job interview waits for me in the morning. The timing isn't ideal, but opportunities like this don't come often in my line of work. The radio plays softly, cycling through static, filled stations that fade in and out like whispered conversations from distant places. I reach for the dial, searching for something clearer, something to fill the silence that seems to press against the windows of my car. As I adjust the frequency, the lights in my rearview mirror draw slightly closer. It's probably nothing. Another traveler heading in the same direction, someone else making the late night journey across these desolate stretches of asphalt. The highway has only 2 lanes here, one in each direction, and there are few places to turn off. It makes sense that we'd be following the same route. But as the miles pass beneath my tires, those lights remain constant, not gaining, not falling back, just maintaining the same distance, as if connected to my car by an invisible thread. I press gently on the accelerator, watching my speedometer climb from 65 to 70. The lights in my mirror maintain their position. 75, 80. The engine purrs with the increased speed, and the landscape blurs past my windows. Still, the lights hold their distance with mechanical precision. I ease off the gas, letting my speed drop back to the legal limit. The other car matches my deceleration perfectly. When I'm doing 65 again, the lights settle back into their original position, 2 bright eyes staring at me through the darkness. My hands tighten on the steering wheel, and I become acutely aware of the sound of my own breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth, each exhalation visible as a small puff of condensation on the windshield. The heater is running, but I feel suddenly cold, as if the night air has found its way inside, despite the closed windows. I try to get a better look at the vehicle behind me, adjusting the rearview mirror and squinting into the glare. But the headlights are too bright, too focused. They wash out everything else, creating a halo of white light that obscures any details of the car or driver. I can't tell if it's a truck or a sedan, new or old, occupied by one person or many. The radio crackles, and a voice emerges from the static. A late-night DJ with a smooth baritone, speaking to insomniacs and night shift workers, and people like me. driving through the darkness toward uncertain futures. This one goes out to all the lonely travelers tonight. The DJ says, his voice warm and familiar despite the fact that I've never heard him before. Those of you on the long roads, carrying your hopes and fears from one place to another, remember, you're never really alone out there. Someone's always watching over you. The song that follows is something instrumental, a gentle melody that seems to echo the rhythm of tires on asphalt. I find myself nodding along to the beat, my tension beginning to ease. The lights in my mirror are just another driver, nothing more. We're both traveling the same lonely road, and there's comfort in that shared experience. But then the song ends, and the DJ's voice returns. That was for you, friend. You know who you are. The one who's been following the white car for so long now. The one who can't seem to let go. My breath catches in my throat. White car. My car is white. I bought it 6 months ago from a dealership in the city. Chose white because it seemed clean and professional and forgettable. How could the DJ know what color my car is? How could he know anything about my situation? I reach for the radio dial, but before I can change the station, the DJ continues. Don't worry, friend. We all have our journeys to make. Some of us are running toward something, some away, and some of us, his voice fades into static, then returns as a whisper. Some of us can never stop running at all. The lights in my mirror seem to pulse in rhythm with the DJ's words. I blink hard, telling myself it's just fatigue, playing tricks with my vision. I've been driving for 6 hours straight, subsisting on gas station coffee and vending machine sandwiches. It's natural that I'd start seeing things that aren't there. I decide to pull over at the next rest stop, give myself a chance to stretch my legs and clear my head. Maybe get some more coffee. Check my map, use the bathroom. Basic human needs that will ground me in reality and chase away these paranoid thoughts. But as I scan the roadside, I realize I haven't seen a rest stop in over an hour. No gas stations, no restaurants, no exit ramps leading to civilization. Just this endless stretch of 2-lane highway cutting through farmland and forest. When did the landscape become so desolate? I remember passing through several small towns earlier, in the evening. Their main streets lined with closed businesses and flickering streetlights. Now there's nothing but darkness on either side of the road. The fuel gauge shows half a tank, which should be more than enough to reach my destination. But I don't remember the last time I filled up. Was it at that truck stop outside the city? Or was that yesterday? The hours blur together in my memory, a continuous stream of highway hypnosis and fluorescent, lit pit stops. I press a button on the dashboard, and a digital display shows the time to 2:47 a.m. But that doesn't seem right. I started driving at sunset, which should have been around 7 o'clock. Even accounting for the long journey, it should only be around 1 in the morning. Have I lost track of time so completely? The lights in my mirror pulse again, and this time I'm certain it's not my imagination. They brighten and dim in a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat made of pure light. I slow down, hoping the other driver will pass me, but they match my speed reduction. I speed up, and they accelerate as well. No matter what I do, they maintain that exact same distance. My cell phone sits in the cup holder beside me, its screen dark. I should call someone. A friend, my employer, the police. But when I pick up the device, I see there's no signal. The bars that should indicate connectivity show nothing but empty spaces. How long have I been driving without cell service? In this day and age, how is that even possible? I try to remember when I last spoke to another person. Was it the clerk at the gas station where I bought coffee? A faceless individual whose features I can't quite recall. Before that, the hotel checkout, maybe, or the restaurant where I had dinner. But the memories feel distant and insubstantial, like scenes from a movie I watched long ago. The radio continues to play, but now the songs all sound the same. The same melody repeated with slight variations, the same rhythm that matches the beat of my heart and the rotation of my tires. Even the DJ's voice, when he speaks between songs, seems to be saying the same thing over and over. Keep driving, friend. Don't stop now. You're almost there. Almost where? I check the GPS device mounted on my dashboard, but the screen shows only static. The map that should guide me to my destination has been replaced by swirling pixels that hurt to look at directly. I try to restart the device, but it responds only with more static. The road ahead begins to curve, winding through hills that seem taller than they were before. The landscape has changed without my noticing, transforming from flat farmland to something more mountainous. Pine trees press close to the highway, their branches reaching toward my car like grasping fingers. In the distance, peaks rise against the star-filled sky, silhouetted against the faint glow of what might be dawn. But dawn is still hours away, isn't it? Or have I been driving longer than I thought? The lights in my mirror continue their steady pursuit. I've given up trying to outrun them or force them to pass. They've become a constant, as reliable as the white lines marking the center of the road or the steady hum of my engine. In a strange way, they're almost comforting. At least I'm not entirely alone on this endless journey. I reach for the coffee cup in my cup holder, but find it empty. When did I finish it? I don't remember drinking it. Don't remember the taste of bitter gas station brew or the gradual cooling of the liquid. The cup might have been empty for hours, or it might never have contained anything at all. My stomach growls, reminding me that I haven't eaten in how long? Time has become fluid, unreliable. I feel hungry but also nauseated, tired but also wired with nervous energy. My body is giving me conflicting signals, as if it can't quite remember what it needs or when it last received nourishment. The curves in the road become sharper, forcing me to slow down and pay closer attention to my driving. The pine trees grow thicker, their branches sometimes brushing against the sides of my car with soft, scraping sounds. I should be concerned about potential damage to the paint, but somehow it doesn't seem important. Nothing seems important except maintaining this steady speed, following this winding road toward whatever destination awaits. In my peripheral vision, I catch glimpses of things moving between the trees. Shadows that might be animals, or might be something else entirely. They pace my car, keeping up despite my speed, their forms flickering in and out of visibility. When I try to focus on them directly, they vanish, leaving only the impression of movement and the feeling of being observed. The DJ's voice returns, softer now, almost intimate. "You're doing so well, friend. So many miles behind you, but you never stopped, never gave up. That takes real dedication, real commitment. Some people would have pulled over by now, would have questioned what they're doing, where they're going, but not you. You understand that some journeys don't have endpoints, only the traveling itself." I want to respond, to ask him who he is and how he knows about my journey. But my voice feels distant, disconnected from my body. When I try to speak, only a whisper emerges, barely audible above the sound of the engine and the radio. The lights behind me pulse more rapidly now, as if excited by some approaching milestone. They're brighter than before, casting my car's shadow ahead of me on the asphalt. The shadow seems wrong somehow, too long, too distorted, as if my car has grown into something else entirely. I check the rearview mirror again, and for just a moment, I see something impossible. The lights aren't attached to another vehicle at all. They're floating in the darkness, suspended in space, pulsing with their own internal energy. But when I blink and look again, they're just headlights again, ordinary and explainable. My hands shake as I grip the steering wheel. The road ahead splits into two paths, each curving away into the forest. There are no signs to indicate which direction I should take. No mile markers to tell me how far I've come or how far I have left to go. I slow the car to a crawl, trying to decide which path to follow. The lights behind me brighten expectantly. In that moment of hesitation, I realize something that should have been obvious hours ago. I don't remember making the decision to take this route. I don't remember consulting a map or GPS for directions to the small town where my interview waits. I simply found myself on this highway, driving through the night, following a path that seemed predetermined. The job interview. Can I even remember the details? The company name, the position I'm applying for, the person I'm supposed to meet. The specifics slip away like water through my fingers, leaving only the vague impression of opportunity and the need to keep moving forward. I choose the left path arbitrarily, and my car follows the curve deeper into the forest. The lights behind me approve, maintaining their constant distance as we navigate the winding road together. The trees press closer now, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocks out the stars. The only illumination comes from my headlights and the mysterious lights that follow me, creating a small bubble of visibility in the encompassing darkness. The radio plays on, but the songs have become wordless now, just melodies that rise and fall like breathing. The DJ no longer speaks, as if his part in this journey is complete. I'm left alone with the music and the lights, and the endless road that curves always ahead, never revealing what lies around the next bend. My fuel gauge still reads half full, though by all logic it should be approaching empty by now. The digital clock continues to show impossible times, jumping backward and forward without pattern or reason. Even my own reflection in the rearview mirror seems uncertain, flickering between familiar and strange, as if I'm slowly transforming into someone else entirely. But I continue driving. What else can I do? The road demands forward motion, and the lights behind me ensure I don't deviate from this path. We're bound together now, the mysterious follower and I, partners in this endless journey through the night. Somewhere ahead, dawn might be waiting. Or perhaps not. Perhaps this is a night that never ends, a road that never reaches its destination, a journey that exists purely for its own sake. The thought should frighten me, but instead, I find it oddly peaceful. I am the white car in the darkness, followed by lights that may or may not belong to another traveler. I am movement without destination, purpose without conclusion. And for now, in this moment suspended between departure and arrival, that seems like enough. The road curves ahead, and I follow it gladly, my eternal companion glowing steadily in the mirror behind me. Story 4. It started with my barista. I'd been going to the same coffee shop for 3 years, ordering the same medium dark roast with oat milk, exchanging the same pleasantries about weather and weekend plans. Sarah knew my order before I reached the counter, often starting my drink the moment she saw me through the window. We had that comfortable rhythm of regular customer and familiar face. Not friends, exactly, but connected by routine and recognition. But on that Tuesday morning in October, when I approached the counter with my usual smile and greeting, Sarah looked at me with complete blankness. Not the polite distance of someone having an off day, but genuine non-recognition, as if she'd never seen me before in her life. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her voice pleasant but impersonal, already reaching for a cup. "The usual," I said, confused, waiting for the moment of recognition to dawn across her features. She paused, cup in hand, and I studied her face more carefully. Something was wrong with it, not obviously. Not in any way I could immediately articulate, but wrong nonetheless. Her features seemed slightly out of focus, as if I were looking at her through water or thick glass. The individual elements were all there: eyes, nose, mouth. The general arrangement I associated with Sarah, but they didn't quite coalesce into a complete picture. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice sounded exactly like Sarah's voice, carried the same slight rasp she'd developed from years of calling out, "Drink orders." "What's your usual?" I ordered my medium dark roast with oat milk, watching her face the entire time, trying to understand what I was seeing. Or rather, what I wasn't seeing. It was as if my brain couldn't quite process the visual information it was receiving. Couldn't convert the collection of features into the unified image of a face. She wrote my name on the cup without asking for it, which should have been reassuring. Proof that she knew me, that this was just some temporary glitch in our interaction. But when she handed me the drink and our fingers briefly touched, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air outside. Her skin felt wrong. Too smooth, too warm, like plastic rather than flesh. I left the coffee shop feeling unsettled, but told myself it was nothing. Everyone has off days. Maybe I was the one having an off day. Maybe I was getting sick. Maybe the particular quality of morning light was playing tricks with my vision. These things happen. But then I encountered Mrs. Chen on my walk to work. Mrs. Chen lived 3 houses down from me and walked her ancient corgi, Buster, past my front yard every morning at exactly 7:45. We developed a nodding acquaintance over the past 2 years. She'd comment on my garden. I'd ask after Buster's health. And we'd both continue on our respective routines. I knew the shape of her face, as well as I knew my own morning shadows. The particular way her smile crinkled the corners of her eyes, the careful way she'd styled her silver hair. But when I saw her that morning, walking toward me with Buster, pulling eagerly at his leash, her face was the same indistinct blur I'd noticed with Sarah. Features present, but somehow incomplete. As if someone had described a human face to an artist who'd never actually seen one and asked them to create an approximation. "Good morning," she said, and her voice was perfectly normal, carried the same slight accent I'd grown accustomed to. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen," I replied, studying her face intently, trying to force it into focus through sheer concentration. But the harder I looked, the more elusive her features became. It was like trying to remember a dream. The moment I grasped one detail, the others would slip away, leaving me with an impression rather than an image. Buster, however, looked exactly as he always had. Every whisker, every gray hair around his muzzle, every detail of his expressive brown eyes was perfectly clear and familiar. He sniffed my hand when I bent to pet him, his tail wagging in the same enthusiastic rhythm it had maintained for the past 2 years. "He remembers you," Mrs. Chen said, and I heard genuine warmth in her voice, but when I looked up at her face, I saw only that strange, soft focus approximation of human features. I spent the rest of my walk to work trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. Stress, maybe. I'd been working long hours lately, sleeping poorly, spending too much time staring at computer screens. There had to be a rational explanation for why familiar faces suddenly seemed unfamiliar. Why people I'd known for years looked like strangers wearing masks of their own features. But the feeling of wrongness only intensified as the day progressed. My coworkers, people I'd shared offices and meetings with for 5 years, all looked the same way. Their voices were correct, their mannerisms unchanged, their knowledge of shared experiences and inside jokes perfectly intact. But their faces were like watercolor paintings, left out in the rain. Features bleeding into each other. Details dissolving the moment I tried to focus on them. During our morning team meeting, I found myself staring at my boss, Janet, as she went through the weekly agenda. I'd looked at Janet's face hundreds of times. She had a distinctive laugh line that curved from the corner of her left eye. A small scar on her chin from a childhood accident she'd told us about at last year's holiday party. A particular way of raising one eyebrow when she was skeptical about a proposal. But now, looking at her, I could remember these details without being able to see them. It was as if my brain retained the intellectual knowledge of her appearance, while losing the ability to process the visual reality of her presence. "Are you feeling all right?" Janet asked, and I realized I'd been staring at her for an uncomfortably long time. "Just tired," I said, which wasn't entirely untrue. The effort of trying to see faces that refused to be seen was exhausting in a way I'd never experienced before. The meeting continued, but I found myself studying each person around the table, trying to understand what I was experiencing. Everyone looked wrong in exactly the same way, as if they were all wearing identical masks designed to approximate human features without actually replicating them. The masks were well made, convincing from a distance, but up close, under scrutiny, they revealed themselves to be artificial. But that was impossible. I was clearly the problem, not everyone else. Some kind of neurological issue, maybe, or a psychological break triggered by stress or trauma I wasn't consciously aware of. People didn't just start wearing masks of their own faces. That was the territory of nightmares and paranoid delusions. I made an appointment with my doctor. Dr. Reeves had been my physician for 7 years. I trusted him with everything from minor injuries to major health scares. Had sat across from him in his small office dozens of times, discussing symptoms and treatments and prevention strategies. His face was as familiar to me as my father's. Kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. A carefully maintained beard that was more salt than pepper. A scar through his left eyebrow from a hockey injury in his youth. But when he entered the examination room that afternoon, I saw only the same blurred approximation I'd been seeing all day. The voice was right, the mannerisms unchanged, but the face was wrong in that increasingly familiar way. What seems to be the problem? Dr. Reeves asked, settling into his chair and pulling up my file on his computer. How do you explain to someone that their face looks like a mask without sounding completely unhinged? I've been having some visual disturbances, I said carefully. Difficulty recognizing faces. People I know well suddenly seem unfamiliar. Ducar. Reeves nodded, or at least the blur that represented his head moved in what I interpreted as a nodding motion. How long has this been going on? It started this morning, with my barista, then my neighbor, then everyone at work. It's like I can't quite focus on faces anymore. They look wrong somehow. He asked the usual questions: any recent injuries, changes in medication, unusual stress, problems with sleep or appetite. I answered honestly, describing the growing sense of unreality that had accompanied my day. The way familiar people had become strangers even as their voices and behaviors remained unchanged. I'd like to run a few tests. Doctor, Reeves said, making notes on his computer. This could be related to several different conditions. Some neurological, some psychological. Prosopagnosia, or face blindness, can sometimes develop suddenly after trauma or illness. There are also certain types of dissociative episodes that can affect facial recognition. The tests he wanted to run were standard: blood work, an MRI, some cognitive assessments, all perfectly reasonable. But as he spoke, I found myself fixated on his face, or what I could perceive of his face, trying to understand the nature of what I was seeing. It wasn't that the features were absent. I could tell where his eyes were, could see the general shape of his nose and mouth, could perceive the movement of his lips as he spoke. But it was as if these elements existed independently rather than forming a cohesive whole. Like looking at a jigsaw puzzle where all the pieces were present, but none of them quite fit together properly. Doctor, I said, interrupting his explanation of the MRI scheduling process. Can you tell me what you see when you look at my face? He paused, clearly surprised by the question. I see you. Same as always. Why do you ask? Because I can't see you. Not really. I can hear your voice. I recognize your mannerisms. But your face looks artificial. Like you're wearing a mask of yourself. There was a long silence. I could feel him studying me, though I couldn't make out his expression. That must be very disturbing, he said finally, and his voice carried genuine concern. We'll get you in for that MRI as soon as possible. In the meantime, I want you to keep a detailed record of these episodes. Note when they occur, how long they last, any associated symptoms. I left his office with a prescription for mild anxiety medication and appointments for more tests than I'd had in my entire adult life. But I also left with the growing certainty that whatever was happening to me, it wasn't something that would show up on an MRI or in blood work. The world had changed around me, or my perception of it had changed in some fundamental way. The question was whether this was happening to me alone, or whether everyone else was simply pretending not to notice. That evening, I sat in front of my bathroom mirror for nearly an hour. My own reflection was perfectly clear, every detail as sharp and familiar as it had always been. I could see the small scar above my left eyebrow, the slightly uneven shape of my nose, the particular way my hair fell across my forehead. Nothing was blurred or approximated or wrong. But I found myself wondering, if I couldn't see other people's faces properly, how could I be sure they could see mine? What if we were all walking around wearing these strange, soft, focused masks, invisible to ourselves, but obvious to everyone else? What if this had been happening all along, and I was just now becoming aware of it? I called my sister that night. Emma lived across the country, but we spoke regularly. Maintaining the kind of comfortable, long-distance relationship that survives on shared childhood memories and genuine affection. Her voice on the phone was exactly as it had always been. Warm, slightly scratchy from too many years of smoking, quick to laugh at her own jokes. I had the strangest day, I told her, and went on to describe my experience with faces that refused to be faces, with familiar people who looked like approximations of themselves. That sounds terrifying, Emma said when I finished. Have you seen a doctor? This afternoon. He thinks it might be neurological or psychological. Ordered a bunch of tests. Good. That's the right thing to do. She paused, and I could hear her cat purring in the background. Could picture her sitting in her favorite armchair with whiskers curled on her lap. Can I ask you something strange? Stranger than what I just told you. When you try to remember what I look like, can you? Right now on the phone. Can you picture my face? I thought about it. I could remember facts about Emma's appearance. Her brown hair, her green eyes, the freckles across her nose, the way she crinkled her forehead when she was thinking. But when I tried to assemble these details into a complete picture, I found I couldn't quite manage it. The image kept slipping away, becoming general rather than specific, approximate rather than exact. No, I admitted, I can remember individual features, but I can't quite put them together into a complete picture. That's interesting, Emma said, but her voice sounded odd, distant in a way that had nothing to do with the physical distance between us. Why, can you picture mine? Another pause, longer this time. I thought I could, but now that you mention it, it's strange. I know what you look like, obviously. We grew up together. I've seen you countless times. But when I try to really visualize your face right now, it's like trying to remember a dream. I can remember the general impression, but the specific details keep sliding away. We stayed on the phone for another hour, comparing notes, trying to understand what was happening. Emma described her own day. Normal, unremarkable, full of familiar faces and routine interactions. But as we talked, she began to admit that she hadn't really looked at those faces, hadn't studied them, the way I had been forced to study the blurred approximations I'd been seeing all day, I think, she said finally. We might want to pay more attention to what we're actually seeing versus what we think we're seeing. After we hung up, I did something I'd never done before. I pulled out photo albums, physical photographs from before everything went digital, and studied the faces of people I'd known throughout my life. Family members, friends from college, co-workers from previous jobs, all captured in various moments of happiness and celebration and ordinary life. And what I found was disturbing in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The faces in the photographs looked exactly like the faces I'd been seeing all day. Soft, indistinct, approximate. Features that suggested human characteristics without quite achieving them. I could identify people based on context, their clothing, their hair, their body language, the other people they were standing with. But their actual faces were as blurred and unconvincing as the masks I'd been seeing in person. Had they always looked this way? Had I simply never noticed before? Had I been filling in details from memory and assumption rather than actually seeing what was in front of me? Or was this something new? A change in perception that was affecting my ability to see not just present faces, but recorded ones as well. I stayed up most of that night, going through every photograph I could find, studying every face, trying to understand the nature of what I was seeing. And slowly, a terrible possibility began to emerge. What if faces had never been real? What if human beings had always worn these approximate masks, and we'd all agreed to pretend we could see through them to something authentic underneath? What if the entire concept of individual appearance, of recognizable features and unique expressions, was a collective delusion we'd maintained for so long that we'd forgotten it was artificial? What if I was the first person to wake up from this shared dream, and now I was seeing the world as it actually was? A place populated by beings who looked almost human, but not quite, who maintained the pretense of individual identity through voices and mannerisms and shared memories while hiding their true nature behind these carefully constructed masks. The next morning, I stood outside the coffee shop for 10 minutes before entering, watching through the window as Sarah served other customers. Each person who approached the counter had the same blurred, approximate face. Each person seemed satisfied with their interaction, showed no signs of confusion or concern about Sarah's appearance. Either they were all experiencing the same perceptual problems I was having, or they were all participating in a deception so fundamental that they weren't even aware of it anymore. When I finally entered and approached the counter, Sarah greeted me exactly as she had the day before, with polite unfamiliarity, as if she'd never seen me before in her life. "What can I get for you?" she asked, and I studied her face, trying to see past the mask to whatever might be underneath. But there was nothing underneath, just smooth, warm plastic, and the impression of features that might have been human once, or might have been designed to appear human to observers who had forgotten what real faces actually looked like. I ordered my coffee and left without saying anything else. The world looked exactly the same as it always had, except now I could see it clearly, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. Story 5. The voice from my phone's GPS had been perfectly normal when I started driving. That familiar, slightly robotic tone that millions of people trust to guide them home every day. In 400 yards, turn right onto Highway 12. Simple, direct, safe. But something had changed in the last hour. The voice was still there, still giving directions. But there was something different about it now. Something that made the fine hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Continue straight for 2.3 miles, it said. and I swear I could hear something that sounded almost like breathing in the pause. That followed. Not the electronic silence you'd expect, but the soft susurrus of air moving through unseen passages. I had been driving for 3 hours, heading home from a conference in the city. The route should have been familiar. I'd driven it dozens of times before. But somehow, somewhere along the way, I had taken a wrong turn. Or maybe the GPS had led me astray. The roads here were narrower than I remembered, bordered by trees that seemed to press closer with each passing mile. In 500 yards, turn left onto Millbrook Road, the voice instructed, and I found myself automatically following its guidance, even though I didn't recognize the name. The road sign was weathered and partially obscured by overhanging branches, but I could just make out the faded letters in my headlights as I turned. The pavement here was older, cracked in places, with weeds growing up through the fissures. My tires made a different sound on this surface, a softer whisper that seemed to match the rhythm of my heartbeat. The darkness beyond my headlights felt thicker somehow, more substantial, as if it had weight and texture. Continue for 1.8 miles, the GPS said, and again I heard that soft exhalation, like someone sighing in their sleep. I reached over to adjust the volume, thinking maybe there was interference from a radio station, but my fingers found only smooth glass. The sound wasn't coming from the speakers. The trees on either side of the road grew taller and more dense, their branches forming an increasingly tight canopy overhead. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of moonlight filtering through the leaves, creating shifting patterns of silver and shadow on the cracked asphalt. The air coming through my slightly open window carried the scent of old wood and something else, something that reminded me of the mustiness of long, closed rooms. In 300 yards to right onto Elm Street, the voice said, and this time I was certain I heard something more than just the standard navigation prompt. There was a familiarity to it now, as if the electronic voice was slowly being replaced by something more human, something more personal. Elm Street. The name sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't quite place why. It sounded familiar, like a half-remembered dream or a word on the tip of my tongue. The turn was sharper than I expected, and my headlights swept across a row of mailboxes that looked like they hadn't been used in years. Some were leaning at odd angles. Others were missing their doors entirely, hanging open like small, dark mouths. The houses here were set back from the road, partially hidden behind overgrown hedges and trees. What I could see of them in the brief illumination of my headlights looked old and tired, with sagging porches and windows that reflected my lights back like empty eyes. Most appeared to be dark, though I thought I saw the flicker of movement in one of the upstairs windows as I passed. Your destination is ahead, the GPS announced, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. But I hadn't entered a destination. I had simply been following the route home, the same route I always took. I reached for my phone to check the address. but the screen was black, unresponsive to my touch. In 200 yards, your destination will be on the right. The voice continued, and now I was certain it sounded different. Softer, more familiar, like a voice I had heard before in a different place, at a different time. The road was narrowing again, and I realized I was driving slowly now, much slower than I normally would. It was as if some part of me was reluctant to reach whatever destination the GPS had chosen for me. The sound of my tires on the old pavement had become almost hypnotic, a steady whisper that seemed to match the rhythm of the words echoing in my mind. "You have arrived at your destination," the GPS announced as I rounded a gentle curve, and my headlights illuminated something that made me press harder on the brake pedal than I intended. It was a house. A 2-story house with a wraparound porch and a tall oak tree in the front yard. The paint was peeling from the wooden siding, and several of the shutters hung at odd angles, but the basic structure was unmistakable. I knew this house. I knew the way the front steps creaked, the way the screen door would slam if you didn't catch it, the way the floorboards in the hallway would groan under your feet. This was my childhood home. The house where I had lived until I was 12, when my family had moved across the country. The house I hadn't seen in over 20 years. But that was impossible. My childhood home was over 1,000 miles from here, in a different state entirely. I had been driving toward my apartment, my current home, not backward through time to a place that existed only in my memories. I sat in my car, engine idling, staring at the house through the windshield. The windows were dark, but I could see the faint outline of curtains behind the glass, curtains that looked remarkably like the ones my mother had hung in the living room all those years ago. The porch light was off, but I could make out the familiar shape of the wooden swing, where I used to sit on summer evenings, listening to the sound of crickets and the distant hum of traffic. "Welcome home," the GPS said softly, and I realized with a start that the voice no longer sounded robotic at all. It sounded human. It sounded warm. It sounded like someone who had been waiting for me. I turned off the engine, and the silence that followed was not quite complete. There were small sounds, the tick of cooling metal, the whisper of wind through the old oak tree, the soft creak of wood settling. And underneath it all, something that might have been the sound of breathing. The front door of the house stood slightly ajar, though I was certain it had been closed when I first saw it. A thin line of warm, golden light spilled out onto the porch, and I could smell something that made my chest tighten with recognition. My mother's cooking. The particular combination of herbs and spices that had filled our kitchen during those long ago dinners. I found myself getting out of the car, though I couldn't remember making the decision to do so. My feet moved of their own accord, carrying me up the familiar gravel driveway, past the oak tree where I had carved my initials when I was 8 years old. The bark still bore the scar, though it was stretched and distorted by decades of growth. The wooden steps of the porch made the same sounds they always had, the third step from the bottom groaning under my weight, the fifth step creaking in that distinctive way that had always announced my arrival to anyone inside. My hand reached for the door handle without conscious thought, my fingers remembering the particular weight and texture of the old brass knob. "You're just in time for dinner," called a voice from inside the house, and I felt tears spring to my eyes. It was my mother's voice, exactly as I remembered it, warm and welcoming and full of love. But my mother had been dead for 5 years. I pushed the door open wider and stepped into the hallway, my feet automatically avoiding the loose floorboard near the coat closet. The house smelled exactly as I remembered, old wood and fabric softener, and the lingering aroma of 1,000 home-cooked meals. The wallpaper in the hall was the same pattern of tiny roses that had fascinated me as a child, though it looked fresher somehow, as if it had been recently hung. "I was wondering when you'd get here." My mother's voice called from the kitchen, and I could hear the familiar sounds of plates being set on the table, of silverware being arranged just so. "I've been keeping your dinner warm." I walked toward the kitchen, my hand trailing along the banister of the staircase that led to the second floor. Every surface, every texture, every shadow was exactly as I remembered it from my childhood. Even the family photographs on the wall were the same ones that had hung there 5 years ago, school pictures and vacation snapshots and formal portraits that captured moments I thought I had forgotten. But there was something else, something that made me pause at the kitchen doorway. The photographs weren't quite right. In every image, there was something different about my face, something that suggested I wasn't quite the child I remembered being. My eyes looked older somehow, more knowing, as if I had always been aware of something that the adults around me couldn't see. "Don't keep me waiting, sweetheart," my mother's voice said, and I could hear the smile in her words. "You must be hungry after such a long drive." I stepped into the kitchen, and she was there, standing at the stove with her back to me, stirring something in a pot that sent up spirals of aromatic steam. She was wearing the blue dress with tiny white flowers that had always been my favorite, the one she had worn to church and special occasions, and sometimes just because she knew I liked it. But she didn't turn around. She kept stirring, kept humming the tune she used to hum while she cooked, but she didn't turn to face me. "Sit down," she said gently. "Everything's ready." I pulled out my old chair at the kitchen table, the one that had always been mine, and sat down slowly. The place setting in front of me was exactly as it should be, the blue plate with the tiny chip on the rim, the fork with the slightly bent tine, the glass that had once been part of a set, but was now the only survivor. My mother finally turned around, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. She looked exactly as she had when I was 12 years old, Not a day older, not a line on her face that I didn't remember. But her eyes were different, older, sadder, as if she had been waiting for something for a very long time. "I knew you'd come back eventually," she said, setting a plate of food in front of me. It was my favorite meal from childhood: meatloaf and mashed potatoes and green beans, exactly as she used to make it. The aroma rising from the plate was so familiar, it made my heart ache. "But Mom," I started to say, and then stopped. How could I tell her that she was dead? How could I explain that this house no longer existed? That it had been torn down years ago to make room for a shopping center? She sat down across from me, her hands folded in her lap, and smiled the same patient smile I remembered from 1,000 childhood dinners. "I know you have questions," she said softly, "but right now, I just want to watch you eat. I've missed that so much." I picked up my fork, and the weight of it in my hand was exactly right. The food tasted exactly as I remembered, the particular blend of seasonings, the texture of the mashed potatoes, the way the green beans had been cooked just a little too long, exactly the way I had liked them as a child. Outside, I could hear the sound of my car engine cooling in the driveway. Or maybe it was just the house settling, the familiar creaks and sighs of old wood adjusting to the temperature of the night. The kitchen clock ticked steadily on the wall, and I noticed it showed the same time it had always shown when I was a child: 6047, frozen in an eternal dinner hour. "Are you happy?" my mother asked, and her voice was so gentle, so full of love, that I felt tears running down my cheeks. I wanted to tell her about my life, about the years that had passed since I had last sat at this table. I wanted to tell her about my job, my apartment, my friends, all the things that made up the person I had become after leaving this house behind. But somehow none of that seemed to matter now. Here, in this moment, I was 12 years old again, and she was alive again, and we were together in the kitchen where I had felt safest in all the world. "I am now," I said, and I meant it. She reached across the table and took my hand, and her touch was exactly as I remembered, warm and soft and infinitely comforting. "Then stay," she said simply. "Stay for as long as you want. There's no hurry to go anywhere else." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows in their frames. But inside the kitchen, everything was warm and safe, and exactly as it should be. I ate slowly, savoring every bite, while my mother watched with the patient love that I had carried in my heart for all the years since I had lost her. When I finally looked up from my plate, I noticed that the darkness outside the windows was beginning to soften, as if dawn might be approaching. But that couldn't be right. I had arrived in the middle of the night, and it felt like I had only been here for minutes. "Time moves differently here," my mother said, as if she could read my thoughts. "Don't worry about it. Just finish your dinner." I took another bite, and another, and gradually became aware of a sound that seemed to be coming from very far away. It was rhythmic and electronic, like an alarm or a phone ringing. But it was distant and muffled, as if it were coming from another room or another world entirely. My mother's smile faltered slightly. "That's for you," she said softly. "But you don't have to answer it. Not if you don't want to." The sound grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it was my phone's alarm, my morning alarm, the one I set every night to wake up for work. But that was impossible. I had been driving in the evening, not sleeping. I had been following the GPS, not dreaming. "I don't want to go," I said, and my voice sounded like that of a child. "I know," my mother said, squeezing my hand gently, "but you can always come back, now that you know the way." The kitchen began to fade around the edges, the warm golden light growing dim. The sound of the alarm grew louder, pulling me away from the table, away from my mother's gentle smile, away from the safe harbor of my childhood home. "Remember," she called after me as the darkness closed in, "the GPS knows the way. It will always bring you home." I woke up in my car, parked on the side of a highway I recognized. My phone was buzzing insistently on the passenger seat, the morning alarm sounding tinny and harsh after the warm sounds of the kitchen. The sun was rising ahead of me, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. I was about 10 miles from my apartment, on the main highway I traveled every day. There was no sign of the narrow roads I remembered driving on, no indication that I had ever turned onto Millbrook Road or Elm Street. But on the passenger seat, next to my still buzzing phone, was something that made my heart skip a beat. It was a fork, an old silver fork with a slightly bent tine, exactly like the one I had used at dinner in my childhood kitchen. I picked it up with trembling hands, feeling the familiar weight of it, the particular texture of the handle. It was real, solid, warm to the touch, as if it had just been used. My phone finally stopped buzzing, and in the sudden silence, I heard the soft voice of the GPS say, "When you're ready to go home again, just start driving. I'll show you the way." The screen was blank, showing no active navigation. No destination entered. But somehow, I knew that if I wanted to return to that kitchen, to that moment of perfect peace and love, all I had to do was trust the voice to guide me there. I put the car in drive and headed toward my apartment, toward my ordinary life, toward the world where my mother was gone and my childhood home was nothing but a memory. But I kept the fork on the seat beside me, a tangible reminder that somewhere, in some fold of space and time accessible only to those who truly needed to find it, there was a place where love waited patiently for our return. And sometimes, late at night, when the world felt too big and too lonely, I would start my car and begin to drive, listening for that familiar voice to whisper in my ear, "Turn right in 400 yards. Your destination is ahead. Story 6. The elevator in my apartment building has always been unreliable. Living on the 14th floor of a 20-story building built in 1967, I've grown accustomed to its moods, the way it shudders between the 8th and 9th floors. The soft grinding sound it makes when descending past the 6th. The occasional complete stop that requires pressing the emergency button and waiting for the superintendent to restart the system from the basement. But I'd never seen a B4 button until last Tuesday. It appeared during my morning commute to work, nestled between B3 and the ground floor button, like it had always belonged there. The button itself looked identical to all the others, the same brushed metal finish, the same slightly yellowed plastic numbering, the same gentle wear patterns around the edges that spoke of decades of daily use. I stared at it for the entire descent from my 14th floor to the lobby. My coffee growing cold in my hands. B1 through B3 made sense basement levels for storage, utilities, and parking. But B4... I'd lived here for 3 years and had explored every accessible part of the building during my initial apartment hunting. There was no 4th basement level. When the doors opened in the lobby, I stepped out and immediately turned back to look at the button panel. It was gone. The familiar row of floor buttons stretched from B3 directly to G, with no space between them. No indication that another button had ever been there. Mrs. Chen from 7B was waiting to board the elevator, holding her small dog and a bag of groceries. I held the doors open for her, stealing another glance at the panel. "Everything all right, dear?" she asked, noticing my stare. "The buttons," I said. "Were you looking at the buttons?" She followed my gaze to the panel and shrugged. "Same as always. Though this old thing breaks down more every month. Mr. Antonelli says they're thinking of replacing it, but the building association can't agree on the cost." That evening, I paid closer attention during my ride home. Each floor button in its proper place, each basement level clearly marked B1, B2, B3, then ground floor. The brushed metal reflected the elevators, fluorescent lighting in familiar patterns, and the gentle vibration of the aging cables transmitted through the floor into my feet like a mechanical heartbeat. But on Thursday morning, the B4 button was there again. This time, I was riding down with my neighbor James from the apartment next to mine. He was scrolling through his phone, earbuds in, completely absorbed in whatever video he was watching. I watched him carefully as his thumb moved to press the ground floor button, wondering if he would notice the extra option. His finger moved past B4 without the slightest pause or acknowledgement, pressing G with the automatic precision of daily routine. Either he couldn't see it, or it had always been there, and I was the one experiencing something impossible. The elevator descended with its usual sounds, the whisper of cables, the soft mechanical breathing of the ventilation system, the distant groans of a building settling into another day. But as we passed what should have been B3, I felt something change. The descent continued longer than it should have, and the familiar pattern of stops and starts felt subtly wrong. When the doors opened in the lobby, James stepped out without a word, already heading toward the building's front entrance. I remained in the elevator, staring at the button panel, B4 was still there, its plastic numbering as clear and solid as any other floor. I pressed it. The doors closed with their usual reluctant sigh, and the elevator began to move. But instead of the expected upward journey back to my floor, I felt the downward pull of continued descent. The floor numbers on the digital display cycled backward: G, B1, B2, B3. The display flickered, showing symbols that weren't quite numbers, angular marks, that could have been letters in an unfamiliar alphabet, or numbers from a counting system I didn't recognize. Then, with a soft electronic chime, it settled on B4. The doors opened. The hallway beyond was identical to the other basement levels, the same institutional gray walls, the same industrial carpet with its pattern of interlocking hexagons, the same fluorescent lighting that cast everything in a pale, slightly greenish glow. The air smelled like concrete and old machinery, tinged with something else, something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in water. I stepped out hesitantly, and the elevator doors closed behind me with unusual finality. The sound they made was different, not the familiar wheeze of tired hydraulics, but a solid, decisive thunk that seemed to resonate through the floor and into my bones. The hallway stretched in both directions, punctuated by doors marked with the same numbering system as the floors above: B4A, B4B, B4C. But the doors themselves were different. While the upper floors featured standard apartment doors with their familiar wood grain and metal fixtures, these were solid steel with no windows, no nameplate slots, no indication of what lay behind them. I walked slowly to the right, my footsteps muffled by the institutional carpet, but somehow echoing anyway, as though the sound were reflecting off surfaces that weren't quite where they appeared to be. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, but their rhythm was off instead of the steady electrical drone I was accustomed to. They pulsed in a pattern that almost resembled breathing. At the end of the hallway was a door marked B4Z, unusual, since the building's numbering system had always been purely numerical. I approached it carefully, noting that unlike the other doors, this one had a small window at eye level. The glass was thick and slightly tinted, like the safety glass used in institutional settings. I looked through. The room beyond was vast, much larger than the building's footprint should have allowed. It stretched away into shadows that the overhead lighting couldn't penetrate, filled with what appeared to be furniture covered in white sheets. The covered shapes were strange, some too tall to be chairs, some too wide to be tables, some with angles that didn't quite make sense from my vantage point. And moving among them, barely visible in the dim lighting, were figures. They moved with purpose, but no urgency, lifting and adjusting the covered furniture, carrying items I couldn't identify from one location to another. Their movements were completely silent. I could see their activity, but hear nothing through the thick glass. They wore what appeared to be maintenance uniforms, but the fabric seemed wrong somehow, too stiff or too fluid. catching the light in ways that cotton and polyester shouldn't. One of the figures stopped and turned toward the window. I couldn't make out the details of the face from such a distance, but I had the absolute certainty that it was looking directly at me, not just in my direction, but at me specifically, with a recognition that made my chest tighten with inexplicable dread. I stepped away from the window quickly and turned back toward the elevator. The hallway seemed longer now, stretching away from me in both directions further than it had when I'd first explored. The doors I'd passed B4A through B4Y appeared to be in different positions, as though the hall had rearranged itself while my attention was focused elsewhere. The elevator was gone. Where it should have been was simply wall. The same gray institutional surface that lined the rest of the hallway, with no indication that an elevator had ever been there. No call button, no floor indicator, no seam in the wall where doors might slide open. I ran my hands along the wall, pressing against the surface, searching for any hint of a hidden mechanism. The concrete felt solid and cold, exactly like what it appeared to be. But underneath my palms, I could feel the faintest vibration, something mechanical and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of machinery hidden deep within the building's bones. Panic began to build in my throat, but I forced myself to think logically. Buildings don't rearrange themselves. Elevators don't disappear. There had to be an explanation, a stairwell or service entrance I had missed. I began walking more systematically, checking each section of wall, each corner where the hallway turned. The ceiling, mounted exit signs, glowed with their familiar red letters, but they pointed in directions that led to more hallway, more identical stretches of gray wall and industrial carpet. The lighting flickered more noticeably now, and in the brief moments of darkness between the pulses, I caught glimpses of the hallway changing. Doors in slightly different positions. Walls that seemed to curve where they had been straight. Ceiling tiles that shifted their patterns like a slow kaleidoscope. When I reached what should have been B4A again, the door was open. Not wide open, but ajar, creating a narrow vertical slice of darkness that seemed to pull at my peripheral vision. The space beyond was completely black. Not the darkness of a room with lights turned off, but an absolute absence of light that seemed to have weight and texture. From within came the sound of breathing. Not human breathing, too slow, too deep, with a wetness that suggested something wrong with the lungs or throat. It followed no rhythm I could identify, sometimes rapid and shallow, sometimes so slow I thought it had stopped entirely, only to resume with a shuddering intake that made the hair on my arms stand up. I backed away from the door, but the breathing sound followed me, growing louder as I moved. Not echoing through the hallway, but somehow getting closer. As though whatever was making the sound was approaching the doorway from within that absolute darkness. The fluorescent lights flickered again, and in that moment of darkness, I heard other sounds. Footsteps that didn't match any human gait something being dragged across a hard surface, and underneath it all, a soft repetitive sound like typing on an old mechanical keyboard. When the lights returned, all the doors in the hallway were open. Not wide open, but all ajar by the same narrow margin, creating identical slices of absolute darkness. And from each opening came sounds breathing, footsteps, mechanical noises, and others I couldn't identify. A soft humming that might have been electrical or might have been vocal. The sound of water dripping onto a surface that rang like metal. Something that could have been laughter, if laughter could be made without joy. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself small, trying to become invisible to whatever attention I had attracted. The sounds from the open doors began to synchronize, creating a rhythm that was almost musical, but wrong in ways that made my teeth ache. And then, blessed silence. The sounds stopped all at once, as though someone had thrown a switch. The open doors remained open. The dark spaces beyond them remained dark, but the oppressive audio landscape simply ceased to exist. In that silence, I heard the familiar mechanical wheeze of the elevator. I turned, and there it was, exactly where it should have been. Doors open and waiting. The interior was lit with the same tired fluorescent lighting I knew from thousands of rides, and the floor displayed the familiar carpet with its coffee stains and worn patches. I ran toward it, not caring about dignity or the sounds my footsteps made in the silence. I threw myself inside and frantically pressed the button for the ground floor, jabbing it repeatedly until the doors began their slow closure. As the elevator began to rise, I looked back through the narrowing gap between the doors. The hallway was empty and still, all doors closed, looking exactly as it had when I'd first stepped off the elevator. But in that last second, before the doors sealed completely, I saw one of the maintenance figures standing at the far end of the hallway. It raised its hand in what might have been a wave goodbye. The ride to the ground floor took exactly as long as it always had. When the doors opened in the lobby, everything was normal, the familiar sounds of residents coming and going. The slightly stale air that suggested too many people living in too small a space. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the building's front windows. I stepped out and immediately turned to look at the elevator's button panel. B1, B2, B3, ground floor. No B4. The metal surface showed no sign that such a button had ever existed. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've been taking the stairs whenever possible. 14 flights up, 14 flights down, day after day. Telling myself it's good exercise, that I'm being environmentally conscious, that the elevator was too slow anyway. But sometimes, when I'm particularly tired or carrying heavy groceries, I still use the elevator. And sometimes, not every time, but often enough that I've started to expect it. The B4 button is there. I don't press it anymore. I've learned that much. But I can feel it watching me. That plastic button with its yellowed numbering and worn edges. I can sense the weight of the spaces below. the rooms full of covered furniture and figures in maintenance uniforms, who move through absolute darkness with purpose I can't understand, and late at night. When the building settles and the familiar sounds of neighbors and plumbing and electrical systems fade into background noise, I listen for the sound of the elevator moving between floors. Sometimes it stops at floors that don't exist. Sometimes I hear the doors open and close on levels that can't be there, carrying passengers who might not be residents of the building I know. Yesterday, I met Mrs. Chen in the hallway outside my apartment. She was returning from walking her dog, and we made the usual small talk about weather and building maintenance. "Oh," she said as we were saying goodbye, "I meant to ask you, have you been down to the new storage level, B4? The building association finally finished the renovations down there. They're renting out space for residents who need extra storage." My blood went cold. B4. Yes, dear. They sent out notices about it last week. Very reasonable rates, and much more secure than those awful storage units across town. I'm thinking of moving some of my husband's old furniture down there. That night, I checked my mailbox carefully. No notice about new storage space. No communication from the building association about renovations or additional basement levels. But when I asked other residents, casually, carefully, as though making conversation, half of them knew about B4. They described it exactly as Mrs. Chen had, as a new storage area, recently completed, reasonably priced. When I asked when they'd first heard about it, they couldn't quite remember, but they were sure it had been recently. The other half looked at me with mild confusion when I mentioned it, asking why. I thought there would be a fourth basement level in a building that had only 3. I've started keeping a journal, documenting who knows about B4 and who doesn't. The pattern changes daily. Who were certain about its existence on Monday have no knowledge of it by Friday. Residents who insisted there were only 3 basement levels begin casually mentioning B4 in conversation a few days later. I think the 4th basement level is growing. Not physically. I don't think the building is somehow extending itself deeper into the earth. But its presence is spreading, becoming more real, more established in the collective memory of everyone who lives here. Soon, I think everyone will know about B4. It will become as normal and unremarkable as any other floor, and I'll be the only one who remembers when it didn't exist. Or perhaps I won't. Perhaps I'll wake up one morning with clear memories of always having a 4th basement level, of moving my own excess belongings down there, of passing the maintenance workers in there too. Stiff uniforms as they arrange covered furniture in rooms larger than the building should be able to contain. The thought doesn't frighten me as much as it should. There's something almost comforting about the idea of forgetting, of letting go of the worry and confusion, of accepting the building as it chooses to be rather than as I think it should be. After all, home is supposed to adapt to our needs, isn't it? And perhaps I need more storage space, Perhaps we all do. The elevator is calling. Story 7. The taxi was waiting when I stepped out of the office building, its yellow form incongruous among the sleek, ride-share vehicles that usually lined the curb. I hadn't called for a cab, hadn't even pulled out my phone to summon transportation, but there it sat, engine idling, as if it had been expecting me. Airport. The driver asked as I approached, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that suggested this wasn't really a question. I paused with my hand on the door handle. I was indeed going to the airport, but I hadn't mentioned this to anyone, hadn't made the decision until that very moment when I'd walked out of what would be my final day at Morrison. And associates. The resignation letter was still warm in my briefcase, ink barely dry on a decision that had crystallized only hours earlier. How did you? I began, but the driver was already pulling away from the curb, merging into traffic with the fluid confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. I studied him in the rearview mirror as we navigated the late afternoon congestion. He appeared to be in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered features that suggested a lifetime of careful observation. His eyes, when they met mine in the glass, were dark and knowing, holding depths that seemed at odds with the mundane occupation of city taxi driver. Flight 447 to Phoenix doesn't leave until 7:30. He said conversationally, adjusting the radio volume down. Plenty of time, even with rush hour traffic. Though I suppose you're not really going to Phoenix, are you, Mr. Chen? My blood chilled. I hadn't told him my name, and while my airline reservation was indeed for Phoenix, he was right. It wasn't really my destination. Phoenix was just a layover, a way station on a journey that would ultimately take me to a small town in Colorado where my estranged brother lived, where I planned to show up unannounced with nothing but a suitcase and whatever courage I could muster. I think there's been some confusion, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You must have me mixed up with another fare. The driver chuckled, a warm sound that somehow made the situation more unsettling rather than less. No confusion, David. Though I understand why you might think so. It's not every day you walk away from a six-figure salary to chase after something you can't even name yet. He knew about the resignation. He knew about the salary. He was using my first name with the casual familiarity of an old friend. And despite the fact that I was absolutely certain we had never met before this moment, I reached for the door handle, some primitive instinct telling me to escape this vehicle and its impossible driver. But we were moving through heavy traffic now, trapped in the slow, moving river of evening commuters. I know this is unsettling, the driver continued, his voice gentle but implacable. The knowing, the way it feels like someone's been reading your mail, listening to your private conversations. But I want you to understand something important. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here because you need to be here. Because this conversation, this ride, this moment, it's all part of something larger than either of us. What are you talking about? I managed to ask, though my voice sounded thin and far away. You've been running from yourself for 16 years, he said, taking a left turn that I was pretty sure wasn't the most direct route to the airport. Ever since the accident. Ever since you convinced yourself that what happened to Michelle was your fault. That loving someone means destroying them. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Michelle had been my fiancée, killed in a car accident 3 days before our wedding. An accident that happened because she was rushing to meet me, because I had called her upset about some trivial work crisis and asked her to come over. An accident that I had never discussed with anyone except the police and the therapist my parents had forced me to see. Stop the car, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Can't do that just yet, the driver replied, turning onto a street I didn't recognize. We're not finished talking. And besides, you don't really want me to stop. Part of you has been waiting 16 years for someone to say these things out loud. He was right, and that terrified me more than anything else. Because buried beneath the fear and confusion was a strange sense of relief, as if some burden I hadn't even realized I was carrying had suddenly been acknowledged by another human being. How do you know about Michelle? I asked. Same way I know about the promotion you turned down last year. Same way I know about Rebecca, and how you broke up with her the moment things started getting serious. Same way I know you've been living in that studio apartment for 8 years. Keeping your life small and safe and empty because you've convinced yourself that caring about people makes you dangerous. The accuracy of his observations was like being struck by lightning repeatedly. Rebecca had been my girlfriend for 2 years, the closest I'd come to loving someone since Michelle. And yes, I had sabotaged that relationship the moment I realized how much she meant to me. Picking a fight over something inconsequential, and then retreating behind a wall of wounded pride when she tried to reconcile. I don't understand how you could possibly know any of this, I said. The how isn't important, the driver replied. What matters is the why. Why you've spent 16 years building a life designed to protect other people from the terrible possibility of your love. Why you're finally ready to stop running. Why tonight of all nights you made the decision to go find your brother. We were driving through a part of the city I didn't recognize, past warehouses and industrial buildings that gave way to smaller residential streets. The meter wasn't running, I noticed. In fact, now that I looked closer, the taxi seemed to lack many of the usual accoutrements of a commercial vehicle. No partition between front and back seats. No posted rates or licensing information. No GPS or radio communication with a dispatch center. Who are you? I asked. I'm someone who drives people to where they need to go, he said simply. Not always where they think they want to go, but where their journey requires them to be. That doesn't answer my question. Sure it does. You're just not ready to accept the answer yet. We drove in silence for several minutes, past rows of small houses with lit windows that revealed fragments of other people's lives. A family gathered around a dinner table, children playing in a living room, an elderly man watering plants on his front porch. Normal scenes of normal lives. The kind of domestic contentment I had convinced myself was beyond my reach. "Tell me about the phone call," the driver said eventually. "What phone call?" "The one you got this morning, from your brother. The one that made you realize you couldn't keep running from your family forever." I stared at him in the rearview mirror, no longer even surprised by his impossible knowledge. Because he was right again. James had called that morning, the first time we'd spoken in 3 years. Not to ask for anything, not to rehash old arguments, but simply to tell me he was getting married. To invite me to the wedding, despite everything that had passed between us. He sounded happy, I said quietly. He is happy, and he misses his big brother. I don't know how to be anyone's brother anymore. I don't know how to be in a family without destroying it. The driver made another turn, and suddenly we were on a familiar street. My street. He pulled up in front of my apartment building and put the car in park. "You never destroyed your family, David. You just convinced yourself you had, because grief makes us tell ourselves stories that aren't true. Your parents don't blame you for Michelle's accident. Your brother doesn't resent you for disappearing after the funeral. The only person who's been holding you responsible all these years is you. But if I hadn't called her that night, if you hadn't called her that night, she might have been hit by a drunk driver on Tuesday instead of Monday. Or she might have lived to be 90 and died surrounded by grandchildren. You can't control the universe by controlling your own capacity for love. All you can do is decide whether you want to spend the rest of your life afraid of caring about people. I sat in the back seat, staring at the building where I'd lived in self-imposed exile for nearly a decade. Such a small life I'd built here. Such careful boundaries I'd constructed to keep the world at arm's length. "Your flight doesn't leave for 3 hours," the driver said. "That's enough time to pack properly. To call your brother and tell him you're coming. To stop running toward something and start moving toward someone. What if I hurt him again? What if I hurt everyone? What if you don't?" The question hung in the air between us, like a bridge I could choose to cross or burn. For 16 years, I had been so focused on the possibility of causing pain that I had forgotten about the possibility of bringing joy. So convinced of my own capacity for destruction that I had ignored my equal capacity for love. "The meter's not running," I observed, suddenly realizing I had no idea how much this ride was going to cost. "It never is," the driver said. "This kind of journey doesn't have a fare. It has a price, but you don't pay it with money." "What's the price?" "Truth. Courage. The willingness to be vulnerable again." I opened the car door and stepped out onto the sidewalk, my legs unsteady after the surreal journey. The driver rolled down his window and leaned out. "David," he called. "When you see your brother, don't apologize for disappearing. Just tell him you're glad to be back." I wanted to ask him more questions. Who he really was, how he knew the things he knew, whether I would see him again. But when I turned back to the taxi, it was already pulling away from the curb, merging into traffic, and disappearing into the flow of evening commuters. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, watching the space where the impossible taxi had been, trying to process what had just happened. Eventually, I walked up to my apartment and began to pack. Not the careful, minimal packing I had planned, just enough clothes for a few days while I figured out my next move. Instead, I packed like someone who was going home, like someone who planned to stay. 3 hours later, I was on flight 447 to Phoenix, staring out the window at the city lights growing smaller below. In my carry, on bag, was a gift for my brother's fiancée, something I'd picked up at the last minute from the airport gift shop. Nothing expensive or elaborate, just a small token that said, "I want to be part of this. I want to be part of your happiness." James picked me up at the Colorado Springs airport the next morning. He looked older than I remembered, settled in a way that suggested he'd found peace with himself and his place in the world. When he saw me walking through the terminal, his face lit up with such genuine joy that I felt 16 years of self-imposed isolation crack open like an eggshell. "I can't believe you came," he said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like home and family, and all the things I'd been afraid to let myself miss. "I can't believe it took me this long," I replied. We talked during the drive to his house, really talked, in a way we hadn't since we were children. About his job, his fiancée, the life he'd built in the shadow of the mountains. About my years of self-exile, the fear that had kept me frozen in place, the gradual thawing that had brought me here. "I always thought you blamed me," I told him as we pulled into his driveway. "For the way I fell apart after Michelle died, for missing Mom and Dad's anniversary, for skipping Christmas, for just disappearing." James turned off the engine and looked at me with eyes that were dark and knowing, somehow familiar in a way that made my breath catch. "I never blamed you for grieving," he said. "I just missed my brother." And there, in the simple honesty of his words, I heard an echo of the taxi driver's impossible wisdom, the same gentle certainty, the same compassionate understanding of human frailty and strength. "James," I said slowly, Did you ever drive a taxi?" He laughed, shaking his head. "Never even owned a car until I moved out here." Why? But I was already letting go of the question, releasing my need to understand the mechanics of what had happened in favor of accepting its truth. Sometimes the most important journeys happen in vehicles we can't explain, guided by drivers who know our destinations better than we do ourselves. That night, at the rehearsal dinner, James introduced me to his fiancée and their friends as my brother David, who's been away for a while but is back now. Not the brother who disappeared. Not the brother who missed all the important occasions. Just the brother who is back now, present and accounted for, and ready to be part of the family again. Later, as I lay in the guest room staring at the ceiling, I thought about the taxi driver and his impossible knowledge. About the way he had appeared exactly when I needed him, carrying truths I couldn't bear to discover on my own. About the price of the journey, not money, but the courage to let people matter again. I never saw the driver again, though I looked for him every time I took a taxi over the next few years. I even tried describing him to other cabbies, asking if they knew someone who fit his description, someone who seemed to know things about his passengers that he shouldn't know. But no one recognized my description, and eventually I stopped looking, because I realized that the driver, whoever or whatever he had been, had served his purpose. He had delivered me, not just to my apartment building that night, but to the threshold of a life I had been too afraid to claim. A life that included love and risk, and the terrifying possibility that caring about people might not destroy them after all. Sometimes late at night, I imagine him out there still, driving through the city streets, picking up passengers who need to go somewhere they're afraid to name. People who have been running from themselves, from their families, from the beautiful and dangerous possibility of love. I imagine him knowing exactly where they need to go, and having the patience to drive them there, one impossible journey at a time. The meter never running, because some destinations are worth more than money. Some trips can only be paid for with the currency of courage, with the willingness to believe that we are not as dangerous as our fears tell us we are, that we are not the authors of every tragedy that touches our lives, that love, despite its risks, is still the most reliable compass we have for finding our way home. Story 8. I discovered the station by accident, or the way most meaningful things enter our lives, through a combination of restlessness and coincidence that feels like fate only in retrospect. It was 3:03 a.m. on a Tuesday in November, and I couldn't sleep. The insomnia had been my unwelcome companion for months now, ever since the divorce papers were finalized, and I'd moved into this studio or apartment with its thin walls and neighbors who seemed to live their entire lives at maximum volume. I had tried everything: meditation apps, white noise machines, the prescription sleep aids that left me groggy and disoriented the next day. But nothing could quiet the endless loop of self-recrimination that played behind my closed eyes each night. So I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the occasional siren wailing through the urban darkness. The old radio sat on my nightstand, a gift from my father when I went to college 20 years ago. AM/FM with a digital display that glowed an aggressive red in the darkness. I rarely used it anymore. Who listens to radio when you have streaming services and podcasts? But that night, I reached for it out of sheer desperation. I twisted the dial slowly, searching for something, anything, that might serve as a distraction from my own thoughts. A static filled the small speaker, punctuated by fragments of late, night programming a snippet of jazz, a truck driver calling into a talk show, the automated weather forecast repeating itself like a mantra. And then, at exactly 3:03 a.m., according to the radio's display, I found it. The frequency came in clear and strong, as if it had been waiting for me to discover it. No call letters, no station identification, just a voice emerging from the electronic ether with the intimacy of a whispered confession. "Good morning, night wanderers," the voice said, warm and resonant, with just a trace of an accent I couldn't quite place. "You're listening to the frequency that finds you when you need it most. I'm your host, and you, well, you know who you are." The voice was neither distinctly male nor female, existing somewhere in the comfortable middle ground that felt familiar without being identifiable. Like someone you might have known in childhood, before the complications of adult identity set in. Tonight we're talking about the things we carry. The host continued. Those invisible burdens that make our shoulders ache and our sleep shallow. The words we wish we'd said differently. The choices that seemed right at the time, but look different in the harsh light of 3 a.m. honesty. I felt a chill run down my spine. How could this stranger know exactly what thoughts had been circling my mind for the past 3 hours? The program continued without commercial breaks or station identification. No call in number, no social media handles, no acknowledgement that this was anything other than a conversation between old friends. The host spoke about regret with the kind of specificity that suggested intimate knowledge of the subject. "There's a particular weight to the mistakes we make in love," the voice mused. "The way harsh words spoken in anger can echo for years afterward. The way we convince ourselves that pride is more important than connection. That being right matters more than being kind." My hands were shaking as I adjusted the volume, turning it down so the words felt like thoughts in my own head, rather than external commentary on my life, because that's what this felt like. Someone reading from the diary of my conscience, articulating thoughts I'd been too ashamed to acknowledge even to myself. The host talked about Sarah. Not by name, of course, but every story, every observation, every gentle question seemed to circle around the central catastrophe of my marriage. The way I had retreated into work when things got difficult. The way I had chosen silence over vulnerability. Distance over the messy business of emotional intimacy. We tell ourselves that some wounds are too deep to heal. The voice said that some words, once spoken, can never be taken back. But what if the real tragedy isn't the wound itself, but our unwillingness to tend to it? What if healing requires nothing more complicated than the courage to say, "I was wrong, and I'm sorry, and I love you more than I love being right"? I turned off the radio with more force than necessary, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was impossible. Random late, night radio hosts didn't have access to the private failures of divorced insomniacs. There had to be a logical explanation. Coincidence. You're the kind of general observations that could apply to anyone's life if you were desperate enough to find meaning in them. But I couldn't shake the feeling that those words had been meant specifically for me. I lay awake for the rest of the night, alternately reaching for the radio and pulling my hand back, afraid of what else the voice might know about me. When morning finally came, I was exhausted and disoriented, moving through my day like someone recovering from a fever. That evening, I tried to find the station again. I searched every frequency on the dial, both AM and FM, but found only the usual mix of music, talk, and late night advertising. It was as if the frequency had never existed, as if I had imagined the entire encounter. But at 3:03 a.m., it was there again. "Welcome back," the host said, as if my return had been inevitable. "I was hoping you'd find your way back to us." Tonight, we're exploring the geography of guilt. Those familiar territories we revisit in the dark hours, mapping and remapping the same emotional terrain until we know every shadow by heart. The voice seemed to resonate, not just through the radio's small speaker, but directly through the bones of my skull, settling somewhere behind my sternum, like a weight I'd been carrying without realizing it. There's a particular intersection where self-blame meets self-pity, the host continued. A place where we build monuments to our own failures and visit them like shrines. We tell ourselves we're being honest, facing our mistakes, but really, we're just picking at old wounds to keep them fresh. I found myself nodding in the darkness of my apartment, recognizing the truth in words that felt like they'd been pulled directly from my subconscious. This was exactly what I'd been doing for months. Replaying the same arguments with Sarah, the same moments of cruelty and cowardice, polishing them until they gleamed with self-inflicted pain. "The question isn't whether you made mistakes," the voice said, and I could swear I heard a smile in the words. "Of course you did. The question is whether you're ready to stop punishing yourself for being human. Whether you're prepared to consider the radical possibility of forgiveness, not just from others, but from the harshest judge you'll ever face yourself." Over the next week, I became a devoted listener. Each night at 3:03 a.m., I would tune into a frequency that seemed to exist only in that specific moment, in that particular darkness. The host never took calls, never referenced current events, never acknowledged the existence of other listeners. It felt like a private conversation, as if the entire broadcast existed solely for my benefit. But the topics were too specific, too precisely calibrated to my psychological landscape for this to be coincidence. The host spoke about my fear of vulnerability, my tendency to intellectualize emotions rather than feel them, about the way I had used my career as a shield against intimacy, building walls of professional achievement to protect myself from the messy unpredictability of love. There's a kind of safety in emotional numbness, the voice observed one night, a terrible comfort in feeling nothing rather than risking the full spectrum of human experience. But safety isn't living, is it? It's just existing, breathing without truly being alive. The words hit like physical blows, precise and devastating. Because this was the truth I'd been avoiding, that somewhere along the way, I had chosen the numbness of routine over the chaos of genuine connection. I had become so afraid of being hurt that I had forgotten how to be present. 2 weeks into my nightly routine, something changed. The host began asking questions that seemed to require answers, pausing as if waiting for responses I couldn't give. What would happen, the voice asked, if you called her? Not to apologize, not to explain, not to fix anything, just to say, I see you. I remember who we were together before we became who we are apart. The question hung in the air like smoke, and I found myself reaching for my phone before catching myself. This was madness. I couldn't make life decisions based on the advice of a mysterious radio host who may or may not have been a figment of my sleep. Deprived imagination. But the questions persisted, night after night, growing more specific and more urgent. What are you waiting for? The host asked. Permission. A guarantee that you won't be hurt again. Some cosmic assurance that love is safe. Because I have news for you, friend. Love is never safe. That's what makes it love instead of contract negotiation. I began to research the station during my lunch breaks, scouring FCC databases and radio enthusiast forums for any mention of an unlicensed frequency that appeared only at 3:03 a.m. But I found nothing. No pirate radio reports, no complaints about unauthorized broadcasts, no evidence that the voice I heard every night existed anywhere outside my own apartment. The logical explanation was a kind of shared hallucination brought on by insomnia and stress. But logic seemed increasingly irrelevant as the host's questions cut deeper, exposing truths I'd been too afraid to acknowledge. Here's what I think happened, the voice said one night, and my blood went cold because I knew, somehow, that what came next would be devastatingly accurate. You got scared, not of her, but of yourself, of how much you needed her, how completely she had become part of your definition of home. So you started pulling back, creating distance before she could leave you first. A preemptive strike against abandonment. My hands were shaking as I gripped the radio. This was exactly what had happened. The slow withdrawal, the picking of fights over inconsequential things, the way I had sabotaged our connection, rather than risk the vulnerability of complete trust. And now you tell yourself it was for the best. The host continued, voice gentle but relentless. That she deserved better than someone who couldn't give her everything she needed. But what if that's just another way of avoiding responsibility? What if she deserved better is just a prettier way of saying, I was too afraid to try? The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 8 months. I called Sarah, not because the radio host had told me to, I told myself, but because somewhere in those nightly conversations with the darkness, I had remembered who I used to be before fear had carved me into something smaller and safer. The call went to voicemail. Her voice, bright and familiar, asking me to leave a message. I hung up without speaking. My courage evaporating the moment I heard the sound of her life continuing without me. That night, the host was waiting. Courage isn't the absence of fear, the voice said, as if it had witnessed my failed attempt at connection. It's action in spite of fear. The willingness to reach out, even when you can't guarantee the response you'll receive. Oh, but what if she doesn't want to hear from me? I whispered to the darkness, speaking aloud to the radio for the first time. The silence stretched so long I wondered if the frequency had finally disappeared. Then, impossibly, the host responded. What if she does? The voice was different now, more immediate, as if the distance between us had collapsed, as if the radio had become a telephone connecting two souls across the static of space and time. What if she's been waiting for you to remember that love isn't about deserving or earning or proving yourself worthy? What if love is just love? Messy and imperfect and brave enough to exist without guarantees. I called again the next day, and when the voicemail greeting began, I didn't hang up. Sarah, I said, my voice cracking on her name. I know I don't have the right to call you. I know I hurt you, and I know saying I'm sorry doesn't fix anything. But I've been thinking about us, about what we had before I got scared and threw it away. And I wanted you to know that I remember who we were together. I remember being happy. I paused, listening to the hiss of the connection, gathering courage for what came next. I'm not calling to ask for another chance, because I know that's not how this works. But I wanted you to know that loving you wasn't a mistake, even if I made mistakes while I was doing it. You were the best part of my life, and I'm sorry it took me this long to say so. She called back 3 hours later. We talked for 2 hours, carefully at first, like people meeting for the first time. Then with growing warmth as we remembered how to speak each other's language. She was dating someone new, she told me. Someone kind and patient who didn't retreat when things got complicated. I'm happy for you, I said and meant it. You deserve someone who isn't afraid of how wonderful you are. You weren't afraid of how wonderful I was, she said quietly. You were afraid of how wonderful you were. There's a difference. That night, I tuned into the frequency at 3 a.m., expecting to find the host waiting with commentary on my conversation with Sarah. But the frequency was silent, carrying only the soft static of empty airwaves. I tried every night for a week, spinning the dial through every possible frequency, but the voice was gone. Whatever purpose the midnight broadcast had served, it seemed to have been fulfilled. Months later, I would wonder if I had imagined the entire thing, if the voice had been nothing more than my own conscience, finding a way to speak truths I couldn't bear to acknowledge directly. A psychological projection dressed up as supernatural intervention. But late at night, when the world grows quiet and the boundary between sleeping and waking becomes porous, I still sometimes tune in to that empty frequency, still listen to the static that carries no message, except the one I learned during those midnight conversations. That we are all broadcasting on frequencies only we can hear, sending signals into the darkness and hoping someone, somewhere, is listening. The loneliness that brought me to that station has mostly faded now. I sleep better, dream less frequently about the past. I've even started dating again. Careful. Tentative steps toward the possibility of love without the armor of emotional numbness. But I keep the radio on my nightstand, its red display glowing in the darkness like a small beacon. Not because I expect the voice to return, but because it reminds me of something important, that the most profound communications happen, not in the bright light of day, but in those liminal spaces where honesty becomes possible. Sometimes I imagine there are others out there, insomniacs and night wanderers, spinning their dials through the darkness, searching for a voice that speaks directly to their particular wounds. And maybe, if they're lucky enough to find that perfect frequency at exactly the right moment, they'll hear what I heard, that we are not alone in our mistakes, that forgiveness is always possible, and that love, even imperfect, even frightened, even broken, is still the most reliable signal in all the static of human existence. The frequency that finds you when you need it most. Broadcasting from somewhere between sleeping and waking. Core between regret and redemption, between the person you've been and the person you might yet become. All you have to do is tune in. Story 9. The text message arrived while I was making coffee on a Sunday morning. The kind of lazy weekend morning where time moves like honey, and every moment stretches into the next. My phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, and I glanced at it absently, expecting maybe a work email or a reminder about some forgotten obligation. Instead, I found a message from Sarah that made me nearly drop my mug. "Thanks for such a fun day yesterday." I can't believe we stayed out until 3 a.m. My head is still spinning from all that dancing. "Hope you're not too hungover." I stared at the screen, reading the message 3 times before the words began to sink in. Yesterday, Saturday, I had spent the entire day at home. I remembered it clearly. I'd woken up late, made pancakes for breakfast, spent the afternoon reading on the couch, ordered Chinese food for dinner, and watched 2 movies before falling asleep around 11. I hadn't gone out. I hadn't seen Sarah. I certainly hadn't been dancing until 3 in the morning. But as I stood there in my kitchen, the fragments of sensation began to trickle into my consciousness, like water seeping through cracks in a dam, with a faint taste of alcohol on my tongue, though I hadn't had a drink in weeks. A subtle ache in my feet, as if I'd been standing for hours. The ghost of perfume clinging to my hair, something floral and expensive that I didn't recognize. I typed back carefully. "I think you might have me confused with someone else. I was home all day yesterday." Her response came immediately. "Very funny." You're probably just embarrassed about the karaoke. Don't worry. Your secret's safe with me. Though I have to say, I never knew you had such a good voice. My hands were trembling now. I called her, and she picked up on the second ring. Her voice bright and cheerful, and completely convinced that she had spent the previous evening with me. Sarah, I need you to be very specific, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Describe exactly what I was wearing yesterday. Oh, come on, she laughed. This is a weird game, even for you. But fine you had on that blue dress, the one with the little flowers. The vintage one you said belonged to your grandmother. Oh, and those strappy sandals that you complained about all night because they were pinching your feet. I felt the blood drain from my face. I owned exactly the dress she was describing. It was hanging in my closet right now. The one piece of clothing I'd inherited from my grandmother. The one I saved for special occasions. But I hadn't worn it yesterday. I hadn't worn it in months. And you did that thing with your hair, Sarah continued, oblivious to my distress. That complicated braid thing, you're always saying you can never get right. But it looked perfect. I even took pictures, want me to send them to you. Yes, I whispered. Send them. The photos arrived 30 seconds later, and I nearly dropped my phone. There I was, smiling at the camera with Sarah's arm around my shoulders. I was wearing the blue dress. My hair air-braided in an intricate pattern that I'd tried and failed to achieve countless times. My face was flushed and happy, my eyes bright with laughter, and perhaps a little too much wine. But it wasn't just that I looked happy, though that was disturbing enough, since I couldn't remember feeling that carefree in months. It was that I looked different somehow, younger, or just more alive. There was something in my expression, a spark of confidence and joy that I hadn't seen in my own reflection for a very long time. I hung up with Sarah and immediately went to my closet. The blue dress was there, hanging exactly where I'd left it. But when I lifted it to my face, I caught the same floral scent that had been lingering in my hair. And when I looked more closely, I could see a small red stain near the hemline, perhaps, or lipstick. My hands shaking, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my photo gallery. Nothing from yesterday. No selfies. No pictures of food or drinks or friends. Just an empty gap where my memories should have been. But when I checked my step counter, that automatic function I never paid attention to, it showed over 15,000 steps for Saturday. Far more than I would have accumulated staying home all day. And my location history, buried deep in my phone settings. You showed a path through the city that traced a route from my apartment to several bars and restaurants I hadn't visited in years. I spent the rest of Sunday in a state of suspended panic, jumping every time my phone buzzed, afraid of what other evidence might emerge of a day I couldn't remember living. But the messages that came were even more unsettling than Sarah's enthusiastic recap. There was a text from Marcus, a colleague I barely knew outside of work.
Hope you feel
That story about your college roommate had me crying with laughter. See you Monday? From Elena, my neighbor. Thanks for helping me move that furniture yesterday afternoon. You're a lifesaver. Coffee soon to return the favor. From a number I didn't recognize. Looking forward to our coffee date next week. David. Each message was like a piece of a puzzle that formed a picture of someone who looked like me, sounded like me, but lived a life I had never experienced. This other version of myself had spent Saturday helping neighbors, making new friends, charming colleagues with funny stories, and apparently making enough of an impression on a stranger in a bookstore to secure a date. I found myself walking through my apartment like a detective at a crime scene, looking for evidence of this other life. In the bathroom, I discovered that my toothbrush was slightly damp, though I was certain I'd let it dry completely the night before. There was a smudge of lipstick on a tissue in the wastebasket, a shade I owned but rarely wore. My favorite earrings were sitting on the nightstand, instead of in their usual place in my jewelry box. But most disturbing of all was what I found in my purse, mixed in with my usual items, wallet, keys, phone charger, were things that didn't belong to me, or rather, things that belonged to a version of me I didn't recognize. A business card for an art gallery with "Call me, David," written on the back in handwriting that wasn't mine. A receipt from a wine bar time-stamped at 10:47 p.m. Saturday night. A tube of lipstick in a bold red shade that I would never have chosen for myself. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, afraid to fall asleep. What if this other version of myself emerged only when I was unconscious? What if every time I closed my eyes, she took over, living experiences I would never remember, making connections I would never understand, becoming the person I apparently wished I could be? I must have dozed eventually, because I woke Monday morning to my alarm with no memory of falling asleep. But immediately, I knew something was different. There was a lightness in my chest, a sense of anticipation that I hadn't felt in months. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked brighter somehow, more alive, as if I'd had the most restful sleep of my life. At work, the differences became impossible to ignore. Marcus greeted me with a warm smile and immediately launched into a reference to the story. I'd supposedly told him something about my college roommate and a disastrous attempt at making souffle. I nodded and smiled, playing along, but inside I was reeling. I'd never tried to make a souffle in my life, and my college roommate, and I had barely spoken after a falling out during sophomore year. You seem different lately, my supervisor, Janet, said during our weekly check-in, more engaged, more confident. It's good to see. Different how? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Just more present, I guess. More like yourself. You've been so withdrawn the past few months, I was starting to worry. But these past few weeks, you seem to have found your spark again. Past few weeks. This had been going on for weeks, and I was only now becoming aware of it. How many days had I lost? How many experiences had this other version of myself accumulated while I remained oblivious? I made an excuse and left work early, driving straight to the bookstore where this David had apparently met me. It was a small, independent shop in a neighborhood I rarely visited, the kind of place with narrow aisles and books stacked from floor to ceiling. The owner, an elderly man with wire-rimmed glasses, looked up as I entered. "Back again so soon," he said with a smile. "I don't think the new arrivals are in yet, but feel free to browse." "I was here recently." I asked carefully. "Saturday afternoon," he nodded. "You spent quite a while in the poetry section." "Very thoughtful customer. You asked such insightful questions about the Rumi translations. And you seemed to hit it off quite well with David. He's a regular here, very nice young man. I was pleased to see you two connecting." I wandered back to the poetry section and running my fingers along the spines of books I didn't remember reading, trying to imagine what version of myself had stood in this same spot just 2 days earlier. The Rumi translations were there, several different editions, and when I pulled one from the shelf, it fell open to a page with a small pencil mark in the margin next to a particular verse. "Let yourself be silently drawn by the strange pull of what you really love. It will not lead you astray." The mark was faint, barely visible, but it was in my handwriting. I was certain of it. This other version of myself had been here, had read these words, had found them significant enough to mark. But why? What was she being drawn toward that I couldn't see? I bought the book and drove home, my mind spinning with questions that had no rational answers. In my apartment, I sat on my couch and tried to imagine what my other self did when she was here alone. Did she look through my things? Did she know about me the way I was becoming aware of her? Or was she simply living her life? Unaware, there was another consciousness sharing the same body, the same space, the same existence. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I set up my laptop to record video while I slept, positioning it on my dresser with a clear view of the bed. If this other version of myself was emerging during my unconscious hours, I wanted to see her, to understand what she was doing with our shared life. I also left a notebook on my nightstand with a pen, hoping that if she was aware of me, she might write something, some explanation or acknowledgement of our impossible situation. The next morning, I woke with that same sense of lightness, that same feeling of contentment and energy that had become the hallmark of her visits. But when I checked the video, there was nothing unusual, just 8 hours of me sleeping peacefully, occasionally shifting positions, but never getting up, never speaking, never showing any sign of the vibrant, social person that others seemed to encounter. The notebook was blank, but my phone showed another collection of messages and evidence of a life I hadn't lived. This time, it seemed my other self had joined a book club, volunteered at a community garden, and made plans to take a cooking class. Each activity was something I'd thought about doing for months, but had never found the courage or energy to pursue. The cooking class was scheduled for Thursday evening, and I found myself faced with a choice. I could skip it, pretend to be sick, and avoid the awkwardness of showing up for something I'd never signed up for. Or I could go and perhaps finally meet this other version of myself face to face. I chose to go. The class was held in the kitchen of a local culinary school, and when I arrived, several people greeted me by name, as if I were a regular attendee. The instructor, a cheerful woman named Marie, handed me an apron and directed me to a station where my cooking partner was already waiting, excited for souffle night. She asked with a grin, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Of course. The story my other self had apparently told Marcus about the disastrous souffle attempt. This was where it had come from. As we worked through the recipe, I found myself moving with surprising confidence, my hands seeming to know techniques I'd never learned. When it came time to fold the egg whites into the base, I found myself demonstrating the proper technique. To my partner, explaining the importance of gentle, circular motions to preserve the air bubbles. "You've definitely done this before," she said admiringly, and I could only nod, because apparently I had, even though I had no memory of it. Our souffle rose perfectly in the oven, golden and proud. Nothing like the disaster my other self had supposedly described to Marcus. As we ate our creations, the other students shared stories and laughed, and I found myself joining in naturally, as if I'd known these people for months, which I realized I had, or rather she had. Walking back to my car after class, I felt a strange sense of completion, as if I'd been trying to solve a puzzle and had finally found the missing piece. This other version of myself wasn't taking over my life. She was completing it. She was living all the experiences I was too afraid or too tired or too withdrawn to pursue. She was the person I wanted to be, but didn't know how to become. Over the following weeks, I stopped fighting against her existence and instead began to study it. I traced the patterns of her activities, tried to understand the choices she made, the people she connected with, the experiences she sought out. Gradually, I began to see that she wasn't a separate entity at all. She was simply another facet of myself. One that emerged when my conscious mind stepped aside and allowed my deeper desires to surface. The book club introduced me to novels I'd never considered reading. The community garden gave me a sense of purpose and connection to the earth that I'd been missing. The cooking classes taught me skills that filled my apartment with delicious aromas and gave me confidence in an area where I'd always felt inadequate. And David, the man from the bookstore, became a regular presence in my life. Our coffee dates, which my other self had apparently initiated, grew into long conversations about poetry and art, and the strange beauty of allowing yourself to be surprised by your own life. You're like two different people sometimes, he said one afternoon as we walked through the art gallery whose business card I'd found in my purse. There's the you who's cautious and analytical, always questioning everything. And then there's the you who's spontaneous and joyful, who seems to trust the world completely. I love both versions. I smiled, understanding finally that there weren't two different people at all. There was just me, the complete, complex, multifaceted person I'd always been, but had been afraid to fully inhabit. My other self wasn't a stranger sharing my body. She was the part of me that emerged when I stopped thinking so much and started allowing myself to simply be. That night, for the first time in weeks, I didn't set up the camera or leave a notebook on my nightstand. Instead, I went to sleep with a sense of anticipation, wondering what adventures tomorrow might bring, what new facet of myself I might discover, what possibilities might unfold when I stopped trying to control every moment and learned to trust the strange pull of what I really loved. In my dreams, I danced until 3 in the morning, my feet aching in strappy sandals, my grandmother's blue dress swirling around me like water. I laughed until my sides hurt, told stories that brought tears of joy to my friends' eyes, and tasted wine that was sweet and sharp and full of promise. And when I woke the next morning, I couldn't tell where the dream ended and my life began, because finally they were the same thing. The text from Sarah was waiting for me. Same time next weekend. I've got my dancing shoes ready. This time, I knew exactly how to respond. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Because the world, I was learning, was full of versions of ourselves we'd never met, lives we'd never imagined living, and possibilities that emerged only when we stopped trying to be just one thing and allowed ourselves to become everything we could be. The other me wasn't other at all. She was simply me, fully realized, finally awake. Story 10. The first package arrived on a Tuesday morning, nestled between my newspaper and the doormat like it had always belonged there. No delivery truck had rumbled past my window. No footsteps had echoed on the wooden porch, steps that creak under the weight of a feather. Just silence. And then this small brown box, unmarked except for my name written in careful, old-fashioned script. I remember the weight of it in my palms, heavier than expected, dense with possibility. The cardboard felt soft, almost worn, as if it had traveled through many hands before reaching mine. When I shook it gently, something solid shifted inside with a muffled thud that seemed to echo longer than it should have in the morning air. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that crinkled like autumn leaves, was a single puzzle piece. The cardboard was thick between my fingers, substantial in a way that modern puzzles rarely are. The image showed a corner of something familiar, a patch of hardwood floor, the edge of what looked like a throw rug, and the suggestion of furniture, legs disappearing into shadow. It took me 3 days to recognize my own living room floor. The second package arrived on Friday. Same placement. Samey mysterious silence surrounding its delivery. This time I watched from my bedroom window all morning, coffee growing cold in my hands as I searched the empty street for any sign of movement. The mailman came and went. A jogger passed by, earbuds trailing white cords. A neighbor's cat stalked, something invisible through the hedge. But no one approached my door. Yet when I finally descended the stairs, there it was. The second piece connected perfectly to the first, revealing more of my living room floor. The complete corner of my Persian rug, now visible in miniature detail. Even the small coffee stain near the fringe was there, captured with photographic precision. I held both pieces together, feeling their edges click into place with a satisfying firmness that made my skin prickle. I began checking the local post office, making casual inquiries about unusual deliveries. The clerk behind the counter, a thin woman with wire-rimmed glasses, shook her head slowly. "No unclaimed packages," she said. But her eyes seemed to linger on my face a moment too long. "Nothing for your address in our system at all." The packages continued arriving with clockwork regularity. Monday, Wednesday. Always in the morning, always in the same spot. I started staying awake, positioned by my window with a thermos of coffee and a notebook, documenting every detail. The paper delivery at 5:47 a.m. The garbage truck's rumbling passage at 6:15. The gradual lightening of the sky from charcoal to pearl to pale gold. But somewhere in those recorded moments, between one blink and the next, the packages would appear. By the end of the month, I had accumulated 23 pieces. The image emerging from their connection made my hands shake as I fitted them together on my dining room table. It was my living room. Yes, but from an impossible perspective. Directly overhead, as if photographed from a camera suspended from my ceiling. Every detail was perfect. The arrangement of magazines on my coffee table, the way my reading glasses rested on the arm of my favorite chair, the pattern of late afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. But I had never taken such a photograph. I had no camera mounted on my ceiling. And more disturbing still, the image showed objects that hadn't been in those positions for months. My grandmother's music box, which I'd packed away last winter, sat clearly visible on the mantelpiece. I started documenting everything in my living room, taking daily photographs from every conceivable angle. I rearranged furniture, moved decorations, changed the position of every portable item. But the puzzle pieces that continued arriving showed the room exactly as it appeared, in that impossible overhead view, regardless of my alterations. The pieces began arriving faster, daily now, sometimes twice a day. I would find them not just by my door, but on my windowsill, tucked behind my car's windshield wipers, once even balanced precariously on my backyard fence post. Each piece fit perfectly into the growing image, expanding the view beyond my living room to include the hallway, the kitchen doorway, the bottom steps of my staircase. I stopped sleeping properly. Every creak of the house settling, every whisper of wind through the eaves. Every distant car engine made me freeze and listen. During the day, I found myself staring at my ceiling, searching for any sign of cameras, holes, or monitoring equipment. I pressed my ear to the walls, listening for the hollow spaces where someone might hide recording devices. The puzzle now covered most of my dining room table, a bird's eye view of the ground floor above my home, rendered in perfect, unsettling detail. I could see the kitchen sink with its single dirty coffee cup, the same cup I'd left there that morning. I could see the pile of mail on the counter, addressed to me in my own handwriting from bills. I'd written checks for just days ago, and in the living room portion of the image, I could see myself. A small figure sitting in my chair, head bent over, what appeared to be a puzzle spread across a table. The detail was extraordinary. I could make out the pattern on my shirt, the way my hair fell across my forehead, even the slight shadow cast by my shoulders. I was looking at myself, looking at a puzzle of myself, looking at a puzzle. The recursive nature of it made my head swim. I sat back in my chair, the same chair visible in the puzzle image, and stared at the impossible photograph spread before me. In the puzzle, I was staring at a puzzle, which meant that puzzle would also contain an image of me looking at a puzzle, and so on, diminishing into infinity like mirrors facing mirrors. I tried to count the remaining empty spaces around the edges of the growing image. Perhaps 40 pieces left. 50. The border seemed to be expanding into areas of my house I hadn't expected. The edges suggested views of my bedroom, my bathroom, spaces I considered private and secure. The most recent pieces showed details that made my skin crawl with recognition. My bedroom, captured at night, showing my sleeping form beneath blankets I recognized on sheets I'd washed just last week. The angle was perfect, unobstructed, as if the photographer had been floating directly above my bed. I could see the book I'd fallen asleep reading, still open beside me, pages bent where my hand had fallen across them. I installed new locks on all my doors. I covered every window with heavy curtains. I bought a white noise machine to mask any sounds of intrusion. But still the packages came, appearing in impossible places with their cargo of intimate surveillance. The puzzle was nearly complete now. Just a few pieces missing from the corners and edges. The image showed my entire ground floor, every room visible in perfect detail, like a dollhouse with its roof removed, and in multiple rooms. There I was, in the kitchen making coffee, in the living room reading, in the hallway checking the locks on my door. Multiple versions of myself, captured in what must have been a single moment, but spread throughout my house like I existed in several places simultaneously. I began to understand that the puzzle wasn't just showing me my house. It was showing me my house at this exact moment. As I worked to place the remaining pieces, I could see tiny details updating, reflecting my current actions. When I stood up to get a glass of water, the figure in the living room portion of the puzzle stood as well. When I turned on the kitchen light, the kitchen in the puzzle brightened. 3 pieces left. 2 pieces. 1. I hold the final piece in my trembling fingers now, this last fragment of the impossible image. It's a corner piece, showing what appears to be the edge of my dining room table and the final portion of my own figure sitting at that table. The piece that will complete the recursive loop, showing me completing the puzzle of myself, completing the puzzle. The edges are worn smooth from handling, as if this particular piece has been touched by countless fingers before mine, as if it has been waiting through all these weeks of delivery to return to this exact moment. To close the circle, I can feel the weight of observation pressing down from above, the certainty that something is watching, recording, documenting every detail of this moment for reasons I cannot fathom. The silence in my house is complete now, broken only by the soft whisper of my breathing and the faint rustle of the puzzle piece between my fingers. One more piece to place, and then what? I don't know what completion will bring. I don't know who has been sending these fragments of my surveillance, or why they want me to see myself from this impossible perspective. I only know that every morning I wake expecting to find another package, another piece of evidence that my privacy is an illusion, that my solitude is shared with invisible observers. The final piece hovers over its designated space. In the image below, I can see myself holding this very same piece, caught in the same moment of hesitation, the same terrible understanding that completion might not bring answers, but only more questions. What happens to a puzzle when the final piece is placed? What happens to the watcher when they realize they are the watched? I think I'm about to find out. The piece clicks into place with a sound like a lock closing, and I wait in the suffocating silence for whatever comes next.